This is the Chrononauts podcast, a science fiction literature history podcast. And we are the Chrononauts. We are taking you on 10 steps upon the quest for ideal today. And I'm here with Nate, my co-host. How are you today, Nate?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing pretty well. Just been doing stuff around the place and getting some stuff fixed up and preparing for tonight's episode. Which,
it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm excited about it because we're doing short stories. Short stories, I want to introduce this by talking about some of my experience, but short stories are, for me, they are perhaps the reading experience that I turn to most often for... I don't know if it's comfort, or I don't know if it's the pleasure of having a single experience and not necessarily having to stretch it over several days. I am a slow-ish reader, so it actually takes me a lot of time to really immerse myself in something novel length, and I really enjoy it when it's good. But it means that, for one thing, I'm very unlikely to finish something that I'm not enjoying if it's long. And for another, it just feels like a short story is a great way to bring across a concept and leave you with enough questions that you keep thinking about it. And if the person who wrote the story knows what they're doing, they can really convey the essence of something in a very clear and concise way. And that even can come down to experimental forms of storytelling. So we have a really diverse sampling of 10 stories to cover in tonight's episode. And all these stories are from...
roughly between Shelley and Verne, I would say, although the Hoffman is kind of a precursor to Shelley, which we'll get into later.
The Hoffman was written at the same time as... same year, maybe the year before Frankenstein, I believe. So that would be The Sandman in 1816. And I think one of the later stories is from 1868. Is there a later one than that?
I think 1860 is the latest one we're doing.
Okay, so so we're starting with a block of stories, and we're going to begin by talking about Nathaniel Hawthorne. He is one of the more known writers in our group today, and we're talking about two short stories, one from Twice Told Tales, the other originally published in Mosses for an Old Manse. Before we just begin a little bit of a rundown about Hawthorne, I'm guessing that some listeners would be familiar with him. And Nate, I'm just curious to know, was Hawthorne part of your school curriculum growing up in, were you in New Hampshire then?
Yeah, New England. So Hawthorne was Massachusetts-based, I think, and he wrote a lot of his stories based around Massachusetts and Old New England. We had to read The Scarlet Letter in the 10th grade. I don't know if that's true for every student in America in that point of time. But certainly everybody in our high school had to read it. It was part of the curriculum for quite some time. I haven't read any of his other stuff until way later. I read House of Seven Gables a couple years ago, and his short story, The Good Mr. Brown.
Young Goodman Brown?
Young Goodman Brown, that's what it is, yeah, right. But yeah, Scarlet Letter is definitely very well known, and I think most people read that in high school.
So, as a Canadian, I have to tell you that not only was Hawthorne not studied by me in high school, but I don't actually know anyone who read any Hawthorne. And this is something that I have come to notice lately, is that a lot of my American friends had to read a lot of books that I did not. And the whole American canon of classic fiction almost is ignored. And, you know, I actually think that's a real shame. I think maybe there might be a certain amount of, this isn't part of our experience, so it's not necessary. Like, I feel like even people in, like, the southern United States probably read some of the Hawthorne stuff. And it seems like, although you didn't mention any short stories, it does seem like some of them are on the canon as well in the U.S., like even Rappacini's Daughter, which we'll be covering tonight.
Yeah, I haven't read that one until this project. Most of the American stuff you'll read in high school as an American is going to be 19th century stuff. There's not really much literature-wise before that I'm aware of. A lot of it is the political writings surrounding the Revolution. and you just don't really cover 20th century American stuff that much in high school courses. We did read like excerpts from The Grapes of Wrath, but didn't get any Faulkner or even some of the more popular.
Yeah, that comes later probably. Yeah, I think that Faulkner would have been above the pay grade of many of my high school teachers too.
Yeah.
But all this to say that Nathaniel Hawthorne is actually very important in the development of American letters. My first experience with Hawthorne was Young Goodman Brown, and the reason is that it's anthologized in many horror books. So that's, coming from a very non-academic, we must study this book kind of background. And I feel I've actually been studying up on Hawthorne. I love doing this podcast because it makes me feel like I'm really going down the rabbit hole with certain things.
Oh, absolutely.
It just, I was looking into Hawthorne and what people think of him, and I feel that it's really interesting because there's a lot of different interpretations. There's a lot of perhaps misapprehension by people that haven't read him and think that maybe he's like this Puritan, stodgy, like sort of dour person who doesn't have any fun or something, and it's just like whatever, who wants to read that boring stuff? And I just feel like there's a lot of gothic darkness in his work, and there's a lot of sadness, and it's often very well conveyed. Now, Young Goodman Brown was a very some of you might be familiar with the story, but it turns very kind of crazy and satanic and dark at the end, and it's like, it changes this person's life forever. He's, as he starts out being a happy man with a wife and a nice home in the woods, and he kind of gets lost in his mind and spirit and body, and he becomes like, he sees the witch's Sabbath and all the people in the town and everybody he knows as part of this, it's almost part of their evil conspiracy, and he comes home and everything seems normal. And you don't know whether, it's this thing that I'll talk about more when we get to the Hoffman, but there's this ambiguity, like, was he just kind of so fucked up? Like, was he actually seeing this stuff for real? Or was it just part of his, his horror fantasy of being, so lost and alone? You don't know.
Right. And that's a big part of some of his other works too. The House of Seven Gables in particular, the ambiguity of spirituality or spirits is kind of always there. It's never really presented in a forward way that later works in horror would.
Yeah, and I feel like he was also really interested in science, even if he didn't necessarily understand it. And I think both the stories that we're going to talk about partake in a certain trend, and I'll get to that in a moment. But let's start by talking about Hawthorne the man. He was born on July 4th, in 1804 in the fated town of Salem, Massachusetts. In fact, his one of his ancestors was a very prominent judge in the Salem witch trials. And not only that, he, until the day he died, maintained that he'd done the right thing and that everything was justified. So Hawthorne, although he's associated with the Puritans, he wasn't actually a fan. And his original family name was Hawthorne, but he added a W to it, and ostensibly this was to distance himself from the ancestors that he didn't like. And his father was the captain on a ship, and he died when Nathaniel was very young. He died in Africa of yellow fever, not very nice. And his mom basically getting them, Hawthorne and his siblings, a house in the country. I think their uncle built it for them or something like that. And he went to college, and he met a lot of people there. He made a lot of connections with the American world of letters and even politics. He was friends with Franklin Pierce, the future president of the United States.
Almost universally considered to be the worst president of the United States, by the way, and the only one from New Hampshire.
Who says that he's the worst, though?
It was
people say that every time.
Yeah, no, it was almost universal consensus by historians for quite some time. A lot of
Well,
those pre-Civil War presidents that really didn't do anything to mitigate the conflict are normally considered the worst.
interesting. Well, it just seems like, especially as America is so prominent on the political landscape, you kind of look at it, and it seems like every time somebody's elected, so many people are just saying, "Oh, this is the worst president we've ever had," or "This certainly the worst in my lifetime," which I guess is a different statement
Yeah, but I
altogether.
mean, that speaks to the nature of current events versus history,
Yeah,
taking something in as it's happening versus having 100 years of retrospect to look back on it.
right. And Hawthorne, sorry, not Hawthorne. Pierce was only president for one term, which usually isn't a great sign because the good ones seem to last a little longer. But
Yeah.
I'm no real student in U.S. political history, but it does seem like Hawthorne was well connected. He was neighbors with Ralph Waldo Emerson later. He was friends with Herman Melville. Moby Dick was actually dedicated to him. Although some scholars seem to think their friendship was a bit one-sided because Melville was a little bit more open and stuff, and Hawthorne was more reclusive and not quite so communicative, I guess. But who knows?
It fits the Puritan ethic.
Yeah, but the thing is, none of we go by the correspondence that Melville sent to Hawthorne, but none of Hawthorne's letters actually survived. So we don't actually know, but it just seems like Melville was always going out of his way to praise him and speaking very, very highly of his writing. Thing is, Hawthorne, as a writer, although he was well esteemed, from the impression that I get, he did not actually sell all that well. And I think that from interpretations of the time that I see is that people thought he was, and this is going to kind of sound silly nowadays, but people thought he was kind of too dark, or he was too not even that, but that his way of revealing the mindsets of people was a little bit bearing and uncomfortable. And again, it could be part of the ancestry of the community he grew up in. Now he in the 1840s he actually moved into a utopian commune sort of place called Brook Farm, and interestingly enough, the philosophy of the people behind Brook Farm seemed a little opposed to Nathaniel Hawthorne's own ideals. He was, they were part of what's called the Transcendentalist movement, and they basically believed in the goodness of people, and that if everybody just worked together and were reliant on their own means, they would have a lot of time to expand on their minds and be free to do fun stuff, and everything would be good. Hawthorne seems to have joined them out of some kind of desire to embark upon a project and maybe save some money. I don't actually think he believed in any of that stuff because it seems to show in his fiction a completely different face, but I don't pretend to fully understand somebody, by reading a few things about them, and there's just a lot of speculation on what, somebody like Hawthorne might have thought because he was a very private person. He did marry into a family called the Peabodys. He married a woman named Sophia, and yes, that is how it's pronounced. She was pretty much his greatest supporter for his entire life after marriage, and he seems to have basically relied on her to keep him from just basically closing himself in a library and not doing anything. His books weren't making him a lot of money, so he had to keep getting positions in places that were, like places like custom houses, doing examining exports and imports, which was not something that excited his soul, so to speak. But it did make him some money, and he started a family. So he knew that he had to find a way to support that family. He once said, "I do not live, I only dream of living." And it seems to have been this existential thing through his life, and it reminds me of what H.P. Lovecraft would seem to convey in his writing and his personality like 100 years later. And there's another New England savant, part of the entire tradition, in fact, and I'm quite sure that Lovecraft himself would probably have appreciated Hawthorne and probably wrote about him, but his influence is actually quite far and wide, definitely on Southern Gothic and stuff like that. His ideas are very pervasive and so forth. So we're basically going to talk about two stories. We're going to start with a story called Dr. Heidegger's Experiment. Before we get on to that, Nate, do you have any other thoughts about Hawthorne the man before we move on to the story itself?
No, I don't think so. Let's talk about the stories for a bit.
Okay, so Dr. Heidegger's Experiment is a story that was originally published in Twice Told Tales.
1837.
Okay, good, thanks. So it's a story about four old people that gather at the house of a physician. And these old people are described as individuals who have basically wasted their lives in various follies. And these three men and one woman are basically there to partake in an experiment. And the doctor shows them a rose that his fiancée had given to him the day before they were supposed to get married. But it didn't happen. She died. Well, the rose is obviously very old because the doctor is also an old fellow himself. And it's withered and decayed. And this Dr. Heidegger describes how he has obtained water from the fountain of youth. And he dips the rose in this water, and sure enough, it begins to resuscitate, and soon it's blooming and live and wonderful looking. And he invites his four guests to partake of this wonderful elixir. And they do. And they instantly become vibrant and fresh and rambunctious and sexual. And, it's basically what you would imagine would happen if you suddenly found yourself, like, completely invigorated and in a way that you hadn't been in maybe 5 or 6 decades.
Everybody's in a very cheerful mood.
Right, and it starts to get a little bit out of control. And there's some chaos. The table spilled over, and the water from the fountain of youth falls to the floor, and everything trickles away. And sure enough, unfortunately, the effects of this substance are quite temporary. Vampires are really lucky compared to these guys. 'Cause, they can just they can always get fresh blood. But they're old again and withered and can barely walk and are stoop-shouldered and all their aches and pains and gout is back, and it sucks. And it's hinted that, the doctor says, all right, I've seen enough. I'm not really going to pursue this line of investigation any further. And it's hinted that the four individuals basically spent their dotage schlepping around in the swamps of southern Florida in the 1830s when there's no air conditioning or anything, looking for this fountain of youth. It really isn't good, because they should be hanging out in their studies, contemplating and sipping on wine and not doing stuff like that.
It is very forward-thinking, and then at the end of the story, a bunch of old people decide to go to Florida.
Yeah, I noticed that. So this that's the end of the story. So it's a very short story, very economical, and I think that it says enough that needs to be said where you are left thinking about it and left wondering about certain things. Do you think this Dr. Heidegger was a good friend to these people?
In a sense, I mean, he gave them back something they hadn't had in quite some time. And they all had, a great deal of fun, and they were resolved to do it again. It doesn't really take a dark turn at any point, really, unlike the next story that we read by him.
Yeah, I I don't know. That's one interpretation, and then I think maybe he thought, okay, I don't really know how long this is going to last or what's going to happen. But I almost feel like, maybe because he had that experience, and it made him, kind of regretful for so long, and he was obviously thinking about it because he took out this rose and he took the trouble of, he's like, I'm gonna use this, and I'm gonna show them, and then I'm gonna try it on them. And you wonder, all right, so why didn't he test it on any animals or anything like that, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
It seems like he's a scientist. He's even a physician. You presume that he's heard of the Hippocratic Oath before. I don't know. I think that he is a shitty friend. That's my interpretation. I feel like, he should have thought of what was going to happen and the temporary effects, and that, everybody's always dreaming about being able to do things over again, but it's something that, and I always dream about this too. I dream about going back to school, and I'm thinking, oh, everything's gonna be great. I'm gonna do well, and then as it turns out, I completely slack off. I forget where my classes are, and
Right.
I don't show up to any of the lectures, and it's like, oh shit, what happened to my resolve, right?
Yeah.
So
No,
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
I think it does speak to some responsibility as far as introducing new inventions and discoveries on the world, but at the same time, it's a kind of discovery that would make him so excited that would maybe kind of cloud his judgment.
Yeah,
And the
and in,
story is also quite short, and it doesn't really go into really what he was doing with this discovery beforehand. So I guess it does kind of leave that up in the air.
I don't think he was doing anything with it.
Yeah.
I think this was his sole intent was to see what would result if he did this to these particular, he wanted to, I don't know. I mean, it is a short story, so it's left up to the imagination. What would he have done? And we'll get to some interpretations of that in a moment. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like he was irresponsible, and not only that, maybe even transferring some of his personal bitterness on them a little bit.
Yeah, in a way.
And that's cool. It's a story. It's a story that it generates conversation because you don't know. He gives you just enough information to wonder about it, and I don't know. I thought it was well done in that sense. There is definitely a few possible interpretations of that. Also, how his former relationship with this Sylvia that he apparently, waited a long time to, he's kind of played hard to get maybe for a bit, and I don't know. Now it's and she she died the day before their wedding day or something like that, and
Right.
so yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. And when you mentioned it's something that could cloud your judgment, and that just kind of made me think. Hawthorne is. People kind of misinterpret certain things and say maybe he's obsessed with evil and stuff, and yeah, maybe in a sense, but I feel like he always he makes the people relatable in a sense, so that when they're doing, and this was in the Scarlet Letter too, which I ended up reading after my exposure to Young Goodman Brown, just because I wanted to see more Hawthorne. But until this podcast, I hadn't read any of the other ones yet. I had heard the CBS Radio Mystery Theater interpretation of this story, though, which is pretty much similar to this. It even takes lines straight from the story, but they have to stretch it out for like 45 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's a real character piece. Like it's really the feelings are a bit more intense and stuff like that. Did you listen to it?
I did not listen to that one, but I did watch the Vincent Price Twice Told Tales anthology film, which this is a part of, and that adaptation is certainly nothing like this story. In that one, they're not trying to have an old people party. They're trying to bring back Sylvia because they found out that the elixir of life is dripping into her tomb, and she's like perfectly preserved after 40 years. So they try to resurrect her, and it turns out there's like a love triangle, and everybody dies at the end. It's just like a really kind of bummer ending compared to everybody having a good time here.
The movie was Twice Told Tales. It was made by MGM, and I think it was probably sort of an attempt to cash in on the Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe flicks, which is kind of funny because MGM is a much bigger studio than American International Pictures, right?
I'm not sure, but they definitely upped the body count in all the stories. So they're certainly appealing more to the horror demographic rather than trying to keep it true to the actual story.
Right, but I just mean that normally it's the other way around. Like, you see the B studios kind of ripping off the slightly bigger studios and stuff.
Oh,
It
yeah.
seems to have gone a little bit the other way around. Although I know MGM had some pretty cheap productions too, right? Like that kind of I don't know, but they seem to have been a bigger studio. Anyway, they did this Hawthorne film, and it contains this story and Rappacini's Daughter and House of the Seven Gables, which we're not going to talk about. But Vincent Price is in all of them, so it's basically like Poe's Tales of Terror movie, which was made the previous year. Which also had Vincent Price in 3 roles, and you'd think that would get. It is a little bit weird, to be honest. Like I don't know. I mean,
he's always fun to watch. I mean, I like seeing him doing pretty much anything.
Yeah, and I do like both movies. I like the Poe movie a little bit more, but I did like the Twice Told Tales movie as well. It's just a little, I like the Amicus anthologies from England because they use different actors all the time, and I just feel like in a lot of these things, it's like, here's Vincent Price, not here's a character.
Yeah, right.
Like in the early days of Vincent Price, he played more different types of roles, and you could sometimes see him as a harmless, good guy kind of type, and so on. But he's a pretty mean bastard in all 3 of these Hawthorne interpretations. So the second story we're going to talk about is Rappacini's Daughter, and this is a much longer story. And yeah, I mean, although I feel like there was some darkness in the first story that was kind of under the surface, this one is pretty blatantly gothic. Like,
oh,
really
absolutely.
Gothic.
Yeah, I love this one.
This is a really good story. Yeah, this is a story about an Italian student in Napoli, he's from Napoli, but he moves to Padua. His name is Giacomo, I think, and he Giovanni. Yeah, sorry, Giacomo is Giacomo is Rappacini's first name, I believe. So Giovanni is in this boarding house in Padua studying medicine, I believe, under Professor Baglioni. And
some sort of chemist or alchemist or something like that. I think all the scientific disciplines at this point are kind of blending together in academia.
Yeah, for sure. I did get the sense that, and maybe even according to Hawthorne, like this is all, it's all in what you name yourself. Like, hey, I'm not an alchemist, I'm a physician, right? That kind of thing. Like Baglioni, there's a bit of an ethical position between these two doctors, Baglioni and Rappacini, you see. And Rappacini lives, as it happens, in a neighboring home. And the window that is in Giovanni's room overlooks their courtyard where they have a garden. And in this garden there are many beautiful plants, along with a beautiful woman. And the woman is Rappacini's daughter, and our young Giovanni becomes obsessed with her and the way she moves among her plants, which he calls her sisters, and seems to express a great affection for. And he contrives to basically talk to her and meet her. And he also is rather curious about Rappacini and who this person is. And he talks to Baglioni, his professor, who knows him. And it turns out they're kind of rivals. And the way this is positioned is that Baglioni is an ethical physician who believes in doing good and helping people. And Rappacini is a more means to an end kind of scientist. And don't forget, though, this is Baglioni's interpretation that he's giving to our young student. I don't necessarily believe that interpretation, because we'll get to that at the end of the story, but it seems that after this warning, which Giovanni does not heed, because he warns him about Rappacini, and he becomes close to the daughter, whose name is Beatrice, which is one of the many, many references to Divine Comedy, to Dante in this story. Literally, it's all over it. And one of the very gothic essences of this story, of course, we kind of mentioned in, I think, our episode, I don't know, it was either 0 or episode 2, I can't remember, but we kind of mentioned this whole thing with the Gothic fiction and how, yeah, much of it comes from the more northerly parts of Europe or, England maybe or something. But they do seem to have, they're obsessed with the decadent southern, like the Italian, French cultures and the kind of idea that these people are something a little bit exotic and strange. And so, you get this sort of sense of fallen majesty. Hawthorne has decided to set his story in Padua. And of course, he hadn't visited Italy yet at this time, but later in his life, he did move to England, where he was actually a consul there. And after that, he toured around Europe. So he did spend some time in Italy and France. So he got to know these things, but not till afterwards. And so at this time, he was just probably obsessed with this idea of fallen majesty and Gothic splendor and so on. So it turns out that Beatrice has a thing. She lives in this garden, and she's lived here her entire life. And not only that, she has an affinity for a certain poisonous purple-blossomed plant in the garden that is lethal. And not only that, she's actually lethal herself. She has somehow imbibed the effusions from these plants and has developed in such a way that she is now toxic, and even touching her is potentially deadly. This is a real problem for Giovanni, who loves her very dearly, although, at some point, as you would expect, he has this whole, oh, you're evil, you're a terrible creature. But the thing is, Beatrice is not some femme fatale vampire chick. I mean, she could be sort of an early symbol of vampirism, but really, she's a pretty sad, lonely creature, and
there's no malice in her character.
No, there's no malice at all, and she hates the way this has gone. She hates the way that she has to. I mean, she's obviously close to the plants, but what kind of life is that? And Rappacini is watching these two getting closer, and oddly enough, he doesn't really seem to mind it. He doesn't really say much, but he's sort of hanging out, observing like a scientist. And so it turns out that eventually this effusion even passes to him, and he is now also poisonous. Maybe not as much so as she is, but he too can kill insects with his mere breath. And as it turns out, though, Baglioni has a solution. Yes, our jovial Professor Baglioni, who actually it seemed like our student was trying to avoid a little bit. And then he kind of, you're like, wow, he's being rude to the professor because they meet up again, and he's kind of like, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And it's obviously, he's infatuated with Beatrice, right? So, Baglioni has an antidote, he says. And it's an antidote that is comprised of everything that's the opposite of the plant, or that the effusions that have basically filled Beatrice's entire body. That's not science. That's alchemy, though. That's definitely alchemy, and kind of reminds me of when this crazy writer in the late 60s, Doctor Who was obsessed with alchemy and occultism, took over for a minute and wrote this story about how the Daleks were looking for this factor that made humans what they are. They were looking for this secret effusion of chemicals that would almost make up the essence of human beings. And then it turned out, of course, they were pulling a fast one, and they were actually just looking for its opposite. So, it's like, oh, it doesn't make sense, but when you think about it from an alchemical standpoint, I guess it kind of does.
Yeah, right.
It's like you right, and you're looking for the...
Which one was that again?
That was The Evil of the Daleks in 1967, I think.
So that was...
Patrick Troughton.
That was Troughton. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
Right.
good
That's
one.
with Victoria as a companion, right?
Right, and they
Okay.
go back. They starts in the
Yeah.
steg.
Yeah. I remember that one now. Yeah.
Right.
So some of the plots kind of blend together of the Daleks.
I know, yeah, but
But
that's one that definitely stands out.
no, that's a good one. Yeah.
But anyway, there's other things that this story is influenced too, but we'll get to that. So, uh, in the end, he gives Beatrice the potion, and she drinks it. Okay, and it kills her because that's part of her essence now. And there's a really shitty thing at the end where it turns out that Professor Baglioni's been hanging out watching, and he kind of, he's like, it's like he's gloating and scolding Rappacini. And sure, he deserved it, but I don't know. I feel like it was just a rivalry, and that Baglioni didn't, he didn't care about her soul or anything like that.
Yeah, it's definitely a
kinda
rivalry.
Like, yeah, and he didn't, he was just kind of. I mean, maybe there's no hope for Beatrice. Maybe there was nothing that could have been done, but he basically just murdered her. Like it's and just to prove a point, maybe, or something, because he thought, oh, I'm the good scientist. This guy's, And then it's funny because I was reading about this and I didn't know because I don't speak Italian, but Rappacini actually comes from the word rapacere, which means to make small in Italian. Okay. So it's kind of, it's one of the things that Hawthorne does to sort of very slyly maybe point you towards different interpretations. Now, the movie did this one too.
Yeah. It was closer to the text, but they changed the ending.
I didn't actually follow. I watched the movie too. I didn't actually follow the ending exactly.
So the ending, exactly. Rappacini, who's played by Vincent Price, kidnaps Giovanni and injects him with the same serum or whatever that turns Beatrice poisonous. So now Giovanni's poisonous too, and at the end everybody dies.
Yeah. So but Rappacini he offers Giovanni a drink or something, right?
So both him and Beatrice take it, and it kills them both. And then Rappacini's so distraught he jumps into the poison bush.
Oh, yeah, that's not as good as this story ended.
No.
No. No, and I did like the kind of the updated scientific weirdness of the story though that they did. It seems like the plant is actually radioactive somehow.
Yeah, it gives off a lot of mist, and it's acidic. They talk about the acid in the plant a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know how it actually works.
Specifically says radiation.
Yeah. I don't know. The visual effects are kind of cool with all this smoke and stuff, and they did a good job with the sets and things like that. But you can definitely tell they upped the body count to kind of appeal to that Vincent Price horror demographic.
Yeah. Which is cool too, and again, more so with Rappacini's daughter than this one, but the stories are pretty short, so and they're putting their own spin on it, and with Heidegger's experiment, they kind of had to because it's very short, and it's almost like this is what Heidegger might have done, right? Maybe he was on this angle, maybe he wanted to see if this was good enough to revive Sylvia. Maybe that would have been his eventual aim in the short story. We don't know, right? So I kind of like what they did with that too, to be honest, because they made it something different. Although,
for sure,
it's kind of funny that that she just happened to be lying in the right spot where the magic water was. That's a really convenient place to have a crypt. Hell, it could. So the movie
I enjoyed the segments for sure, even though they did differ from the text. I mean, they were fun.
Yeah, and the movie was basically Hawthorne by way of Poe.
Yeah,
is what
that's a good way to put it. And 1960s Roger Corman Poe at that.
Yeah, there were certain things that were definitely way more Poe-like than Hawthorne-like.
Yeah,
I thought, and it's kind of weird because Hawthorne and Poe they strike me as being a little bit, even though they were writing around the same time, and Poe actually did talk about his feelings about Hawthorne's writing. Hint, he thought he was a very good writer, but he still didn't like him very much. But they seem a little bit, Hawthorne is very much about atmosphere and feeling and intensity of emotion, whereas Poe has a very precise, almost meticulous, scientific style about his writing most of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, he is known for some poetic stuff and all that. But 90% of Poe, I'd say, although he throws out really awesome imagery and stuff, it's quite it's almost pedantic in its writing style, and I find that very different from Hawthorne's approach. So it's it's weird having those two approaches in the film, but I think it kind of works. I'm just curious, can you think of any other things that might have been influenced by these two stories?
I don't know. That's a good point. Beatrice is clearly the personification of poison, and I'm sure you can see that in various, superhero, other science fiction things.
Yeah, she is very definitively the inspiration for Poison Ivy and Batman.
Yeah, there you go.
That's not a theory. That's a statement of fact.
Yeah.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me too of this little scene. There's this little scene Hammer movie from '60s called "These Are the Damned," and it's basically about it's this Cold War movie about this scientist who basically has taken a bunch of orphan children and induced radioactivity into them, and his whole idea behind that is to prepare a coming generation for when the nuclear holocaust comes, which he thinks will be very soon. It's a really interesting, sad story because, there's basically no hope for these kids, and even being around them is terrible. Yeah. It's a really, really good film. I recommend it very highly. Oliver Reed plays a really crazy character in it, which is awesome, of course. And there's a really awesome performance from a Swedish actress. I can't remember her name, but it's really cool and it's really sad. It'll definitely has an ending that probably even exceeds the Rappacini's daughter story in terms of that's really shitty.
Yeah, so you have to check it out.
Yeah, do check that out for sure. There's been a few interpretations of this. There's actually a musical that I was kind of talking to you about earlier. Couldn't really find much about it. Apparently, it was
a couple musicals actually. There was an off-Broadway play that was performed a couple times starting in the 80s, which the music was composed by Michael Cohen, not the Trump lackey, but an actual opera composer guy. But there was a more recent one that was played out of New Orleans or something like that.
Yeah, it seems to have been a story about it's more loose adaptation. The other one seems to be medieval, and this one is more jazz New Orleans, and this guy trying to find his mojo again, and he meets this girl who's the name of it is Beautiful Poison. I kind of get the sense that it's a bit a bit more noir femme fatale-ish kind of, but I don't know because we couldn't find a lot about it. It was supposed to have been it's around 2014 was when it was commissioned, but I listened to one of the songs. It was pretty cool. So that's Hawthorne. I really enjoyed the experience, and you talked about how much you enjoyed Rappacini's daughter.
Yeah,
I think we both did, and there was actually one of his suggestions that I received when I sort of first kind of started putting out feelers about what kind of stories I would want to do for a podcast like this. I can't remember what stage we were at that point. We definitely hadn't recorded episode 0 yet.
Right.
So, I'm definitely gonna. I've read a few more Hawthorne stories. I realized over the years, mostly again in horror and or supernatural anthologies.
Right.
It's interesting because he seems to be one of those authors that bridges the gap between sort of more literary classic and genre fiction.
Yeah, and there's a couple that do that, especially in this episode that we're coming up.
Oh, I was just going to say before we move on to Hoffman, there was one thing I wanted to bring up that there's a theme that I think we will see through some of the coming episodes, and science does weave its way in and out of many of these stories. I think that a misinterpretation that some people have, especially of older, almost cusp of the industrial revolution fiction, is that there's so much anti-science. But I think a smart writer, even like Hawthorne, would say it's not so much about that. Eric Rapkin, whose lectures he did a bunch of lectures on fantasy and science fiction, and they kind of helped generate some thought processes for me for doing these podcasts. And he describes something called the Eden complex, which he links to both Oedipus and the myth of Prometheus, and he basically says that it's a distortion, if you will, of the positive power of science to attempt to return to the Garden of Eden, and that somebody like Hawthorne would say that's a very bad use of science because Hawthorne being a religious person, but not an ignorant person by any means. In fact, a very learned and smart person with an open mind. He would have said that yeah, we, that is a thing that we lost, and we're not, any attempt to go back there is not good for us, and it's lethal to us as forward-thinking human beings. So yeah, it's interesting, and you get various themes throughout some of these stories. Some of them more sort of hysterical sounding than others, but I think good writers generally know how to avoid certain pitfalls, right? So we're going to move from America to East Prussia now and talk about a writer named Ernst Theodor Amadeus Hoffmann. The Amadeus in his name, in fact, being an affectation. His name, Wilhelm, he changed to Amadeus because he just admired Mozart so much. So yes, Ernst Theodor Wilhelm Hoffmann. He was born in 1776, and he was born in East Prussia. It's now would be considered part of Russia, but he was definitely very German. He was a very much a Renaissance man. He was an artistic man, but he was also a legal counselor. He was a writer of plays and fiction and nonfiction. He was a music critic. He was a composer. He played the piano. He was very much a person who was inspired by the arts and being, as well-rounded an individual as in that area as he could be. And you see art reflected in a lot of his stories and how much, how much it really affects people. A bit of an unruly guy. Got into a lot of trouble over the years. He was a piano teacher, and he seemed to have a thing for a lot of his young students. And he was sort of involved in politics for a while too, but he had a way of annoying people, and he liked to draw caricatures and military officers and politicians and stuff like that. And so he was getting into a lot of trouble. He had to flee several times because the French were invading Napoleon's army and all that stuff. Yeah, it seems like he had quite an interesting life. He actually died of syphilis. So I don't know. He was married, but he definitely seemed quite free with himself. So who knows? He is another Gothic writer. He's definitely known as a strong part of the Gothic tradition that maybe is not as well known in this part of the world as the English writers.
No, definitely not to me anyway. I first stumbled upon him for one of his other stories, The Automaton, just looking for something completely different. And I thought that story was just okay, so I figured he was like just a minor footnote in the history of the genre. But apparently he was a major influence on the Romantic movement as a whole. And you can really see that in this story, that it covers more the spooky German folklore, horror-ish type themes.
Yeah, definitely. Although this story, oddly enough, ends up in Italy as well. But and also concerns a character named Nathaniel. There's some odd striking.
Yeah, though the spelling of this is odd. It's not spelled in the same way that the American author is.
No. I just sometimes notice these things.
Right. I've just never seen a name spelled that way.
Yeah. But so he actually wrote a lot of stuff. He wrote a lot of short stories, a lot of novels. He's quite prolific, influenced all over the place. And we're talking about one of his actually most famous stories, as it turns out, which I also hadn't really heard of till now. Although, I've heard Hoffman's name a bit bandied around, but he's pretty new to me. So this story is quite a ride. uh, this is definitely, in some ways, the darkest one, I
Yeah,
think.
I would say so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was written in 1816.
2 years before the publication before Frankenstein, which is,
Right.
I think, absolutely fascinating because they were doing the writing contest of who could write the scariest story after reading a bunch of German spooky stuff, and the themes that are presented in this story, namely the creation of another being and the way that being is described, it almost feels like there's more science fiction elements in this story than there are in Frankenstein. So it kind of makes you think of the concept of genre and authorship when it comes to the creation of such, and that it's not like a Jenga tower or something like that where you pull out the bottom block and it all falls down, but more of a gigantic stew where all these ingredients come together and merge and form something cohesive. I think it's possible, though I don't have any confirmation of this, that Mary Shelley could have read this before she wrote Frankenstein.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention that too. Like, I was wondering if this was one of the scary stories that they were reading. And it seems like this story has been heavily referenced. We'll get to that after we describe the story, but there's a lot of interesting connections with this one. So this story incorporates so many things and so many themes. I want to try to cover most of them, but if we don't get to all of them, there are other sources. So the story starts with 3 letters written by, again, we have a young man who's a student, and although we'll come to that, but he first describes his childhood trauma, and he describes how basically his nurse told him about this thing called the Sandman, and it was a thing that was used to sort of threaten him when he wouldn't go to sleep. And it says, the Sandman is a myth, a thing that probably a lot of people have heard of, and usually I think that probably the English domesticated him a little bit, and he's something nice,
Absolutely, especially in American popular culture. I mean, German
Right.
folklore tales have always been way more nasty than the
Yeah,
American
yeah. And
versions.
we got these fun songs like, "Oh, the Sandman's gonna come and sprinkle a dream in my eye. It's gonna be so nice." And no, this story is like, well, yeah, he actually throws hot ashes in your eyes, and if you're not careful, he might actually take them and feed them to his children. So he's not a nice Sandman, not at all. And so at night, Nathaniel describes how he's sitting around with his family and stuff, and often his mom will send him to a bed by a certain time, but of course he's a kid and he doesn't want to. He often hears these creaky footsteps, and he knows that somebody's in the house, and it sounds very ominous to him, and of course uh, he associates it with this Sandman now because that's a thing that's been given to him. Why wouldn't he? Meanwhile, there's this mean old man called Coppelius who likes to show up at the house and eat with them and do nasty things like stick his fingers in the kids' food. It's really nasty. It's like this guy's like described in such a vile way that it almost makes you feel like not good. It's like, ugh, this is a horrible human being, and this is obviously Nathaniel's interpretation. But sorry, if a guy's sticking his fingers in your food and laughing about it, like there's something wrong, and who knows, right? But apparently he's not exactly a friend of Nathaniel's dad. He's
No,
no,
no.
and they're practicing some kind of possibly alchemy together. Although this is the thing with Hoffman, apparently it's something that you can see across all his stories. So far, I've only read this one, but again, I'm definitely interested in reading more now. But there's a thing where you're never 100% sure about what he's telling you, and there's always ambiguity. So, are they doing alchemy? Maybe they're doing something really simple. I even read one interpretation where it said, "Hey, maybe they're making coins, like maybe they're forging money or something like that." It could be that simple, but it's probably not. And because we have minds tuned to fantasy, we like to see other things in it. And I think that Hoffman does too. So, anyway, one day, Nathaniel decides that he wants to know what his father's actually doing and what's going on. So instead of going to bed, he hides in a closet or something like that in the room that his father uses. I guess it's his study or something like that. And Coppelius and his father are there, and they seem to be about to be engaged in something. But then Nathaniel makes a noise, and he is discovered by Coppelius, who proceeds to explode into this mad tirade and tell him that he's going to take his eyes out and he's going to kill him, basically. And he starts pulling at his limbs, like almost like he wants to see how he works. And he's like, "You're very well put together, aren't you, boy?" And it's just, and then it's almost like Nathaniel swoons and he's not conscious anymore. Now these letters that are being sent to his friend, but one interesting thing that happens is that although he means to send one letter to his friend, he ends up sending it to his sister instead. That is his friend's sister. And her name is Clara. It's yet another Clara. We keep coming across them, don't we?
Number 3, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
We'll have to keep a running count.
No, but it's one of these things that comes to you, right? So it's like these names kind of similar. So Clara would seem to be the love of his life, and she's a very rational girl, and she's very reassuring. She's clearly a good presence in his life, because you kind of feel like Nathaniel might be just slightly fragile. Yeah, like maybe he's prone to fits and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So after this happens, Coppelius isn't around for a while, and Nathaniel doesn't want to bring him up. Nobody else wants to bring him up because you get the idea that his dad and Coppelius caught up fought, because I'm sure his father wasn't too pleased with the way he was treating his son. But one day, father seems kind of preoccupied and he's a little unhappy, and he tells his wife, he's like, "Oh, Coppelius is coming, and this is the last time I'll see him." And so you get the idea that he wants to, burn the bridge, just kind of like end things. But at some point when Coppelius is over and in the study with him, there is an explosion of some kind, and Nathaniel's father is killed. And that is the opening of the story, describing how this happened and how this childhood trauma ties into the fact that his father has been killed. He's been taken away from him forever.
And now he's swearing revenge.
Now, well, he doesn't outright say it, but you kind of feel like it's obviously stuck in his unconscious mind in such a way, right? And so, sure enough, yes, he goes to school, and he is another another sort of lowly student. We're actually going to see a few of those this episode. It's kind of
Yeah, I think this story, Rappacini's daughter, and the next story have a lot in common in the structure, but we'll get to the comparisons later.
Yeah, they're well chosen, so good job on that. Although I picked the Hawthorns, but yeah. So he knows this professor
Spallanzani.
Spallanzani. That's right. Yeah. So I'm not too fast on the uptake with the searching sometimes. So Professor Spallanzani is his teacher, and he knows this person whose name is Coppola, who's described as a mechanic, which of course is not the modern interpretation of a mechanic, but somebody who makes mechanisms. He's particularly into optics, apparently. Well, Nathaniel sees that there is some kind of resemblance between Coppola and his old enemy, Coppelius. He thinks that they're the same person. Clara, in her letter, assures him that probably isn't true, and sure enough, later he kind of changes his tone. It's like, no, they're not the same person. It's I'm sorry, my head's not on straight sometimes. Meanwhile, this professor has a daughter or something. Her name is Olympia, and well, one day, and the thing is, Nathaniel can see her through the window, and she just kind of sits there. She doesn't do anything, and this is kind of a trope that's actually it's in a way in all three stories that we're talking about, right? The woman that sort of seduces this person from afar and not even saying anything or doing anything really. And it's a trope that I find a little bit annoying. But oddly enough, it's not that annoying in this one, or even less so in Rappacini's Daughter, because
Yeah.
it just kind of works, right? So
I
and,
mean, it does kind of speak to the male gaze in fiction that this kind of stalkerish behavior
yeah,
is kind of presented in like a positive light, almost as a courtship rather than like kind of a creepy obsession. Although it is kind of portrayed as being more obsessive here than in
right.
Rappaccini.
Yeah, and we'll get to a story very shortly where it's kind of stupid. But I think in these two stories, it's actually good. It's well handled.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's it's not. I think the reason that it kind of annoys me sometimes isn't so much that it's creepy and stalkerish. It just seems more shallow than anything else.
right.
And I just I personally find it a little bit like, oh, get on with your life and find out something interesting at least, right? So, but anyway, we can't blame Nathaniel for anything basically as things transpire. I mean, it's just he's a poor kid caught in things that are spiraling and not good. So, he goes to a party held by this professor, and at this party, there's a whole bunch of kind of well-to-do people, and it's a good society event basically. There's dancing, celebration, and he has this girl there, and her name is Olympia, and this is the first time that Nathaniel has sort of gotten to really interact with her, and well, he seems to be smitten, obviously, and he's speaking nonsense to her and being kind of ridiculous. He thinks that she's the most beautiful thing in the world, but everybody else is kind of laughing at him and laughing at them and acting weird, and he doesn't really understand why. It's really perplexing and strange the way it's done, and it was just like, wow, this story just took a really unexpected turn, because it's just and then this whole aspect of it where we get a real sense of the uncanny. And there people talk about the concept of the uncanny valley, and I thought that didn't really come around till the 1970s. Like seriously, this whole idea that something can be so close to resembling something that we know, like for example the human form, but there's something about it that's so alienating that it's extremely off-putting.
Yeah, and she's
And
portrayed as being a savant at playing the piano and singing and dancing, but her movements are portrayed as being very strange. Her speech patterns are odd. She's very cold emotionally in her body language.
yeah, and it's actually maybe she doesn't even say anything. She sings, but it's almost like hey, that's part of the mechanism. And he's so besotted that he doesn't even seem to realize that they're not really having a conversation. They're just having he's just saying a bunch of stuff, and she's kind of making noise and maybe nodding her head sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And well, it turns out that this Olympia is indeed an automaton. She is an artificial creation made with clockwork, and everybody else seems to kind of know this. Like, it seems to be almost common knowledge. But after this happens at the party, because nobody was, I think everybody just kind of thought, oh, this professor's weird and he's got weird things going on. I don't think anybody expected anything like this. And it seems like a lot of people are put off by it, and there's, reports in the newspapers of all this strangeness at the party, and how this, and even maybe how this young guy embarrassed himself a little bit. And it's a really funny scene. We were kind of discussing it earlier. It's sort of the ramifications of this and what society thought about it. And again, that's just not something I was expecting to see from a story in 1816.
Right. They were all pissed at Spallanzani because he flees to escape potential fraud charges. You know, the fraud being introducing an automaton in polite society, passing her off as an actual human. But it just kind of blows up in her face. She, like crashes and burns and falls over, and Nathaniel's made the fool.
Yeah, and it's and he goes into all this stuff about how now people have to check themselves and they have to when they meet somebody they have to make sure that they're a real person and stuff like that.
Right.
Like that's seriously like something out of Alien Nation or something like that. Like
Yeah.
it's just so whoa. I don't know, like that was a huge surprise for me just seeing that. I mean, obviously it was expressed in in a different way. It's not like all of a sudden the writing got super modern or anything, but it's just the way that that was expressed was really different. And well, Nathaniel's had a couple of run-ins with Coppola during all this, and he has gotten some kind of eyeglass from him, even though he really just wanted him to go away. But he wouldn't leave, and he was kind of pestering him and being strange and off-putting again. And we get that, and there's a lot of that in this story of just like people not acting right. And we don't know if they're really not acting right necessarily, or whether maybe Nathaniel is just seeing things that are not really applicable. There's just so much ambiguity, and I like it a lot about these kind of stories, because I think that is actually a key element in fantasy, is having that ambiguity. And there's a famous there's a thing that people use to illustrate ambiguity sometimes, and it goes something like this. It goes, I was walking down the street and I turned into a drugstore. And you can sort of see that sentence and you'd be like, well, okay, so the meaning is pretty obvious, right? But, well, maybe that's not, maybe it's something else. Like, maybe it's something really, really bizarre, right? Like that you'd see in some weird drug movie or something like that. There are people, and people have said that to me, that one of their most common nightmares is somebody that they know or love turning into a weird inanimate object or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's, kind of touches again on that feeling of the uncanny and weird, right? So, so he has this eyeglass from Coppola that he likes to look into, and there's been all this weird stuff too about, the eyes, which is a recurring theme in the story, and how eyes have a lot of meaning for various obvious reasons. The people talk about being the window to the soul and all that, and like they're also though the key to perception for most people, and so the fact that Nathaniel is worried about his eyes being taken, and this seems to be Coppelius's thing. Well, that would seem to suggest some strange things about Nathaniel's perceptions. And so one day, though, he hears a commotion in the professor's rooms, and it turns out that Coppola is there, and he and the professor are having a fight, and Olympia is also there, and they seem to be fighting over her. And I think the suggestion to me was that they were both somehow participants in her creation, and maybe once Coppelius, I don't know,
that was
who
definitely
knows?
the impression that I got, that he supplied her eyes.
Yeah, and again, we don't want to interpret so far, because Hoffman's not telling us what to think, but I mean, there's a lot of implications there that maybe Coppelius moved on from Nathaniel's dead dad and found a new sponsor, patron, or whatever, right? So anyway, Olympia, the automaton, is broken into a million pieces. She's gone. Coppola has run off. The professor Spallanzani, he is like screaming and enraged, and apparently he throws eyes at Nathaniel. It's like, here, he took yours, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a very strange statement that leaves you wondering so many things. Jeez, man. Nathaniel's been really having a bad time, and he's obviously very upset over Olympia and doesn't know what to think, because his friend's telling him that he's being an idiot, obviously, and he's not paying attention to Clara. He's almost forgotten all about her, and when he last saw her, he was writing really bad poetry that had nothing to do with her. So
She wasn't a fan of it either.
No, not at all. Not at all. And actually, he and her brother got into a fight over it, and they almost had a duel.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was that bad. And but Clara is very faithful, and so she's back, and she's trying to help him, and so forth. But he goes. They go to look down on the city, and they're in a nice high place, and he has his glass, and he looks through it, and he sees something he doesn't like, and he kind of has a fit. And it was funny the way that they did this was so horror. Like the way that Hoffman did this was so classic horror. Like it almost seemed like Nathaniel had just woken up from a dream, and that maybe things would be good now.
Right.
It's like, oh, okay, maybe everything's gonna be okay. And then it's like, ah, and then screaming madness,
Yeah.
and he ends up throwing Clara off the parapet, and all of a sudden in the square, who should show up? But Coppelius, not Coppola this time, but very definitively Coppelius, and he's being taunted, and it's just, yeah, and the story ends very violently and brutally, except that we get a weird throwaway line about Clara having another husband at the end.
Yeah,
but,
she lives happily ever after, so good for her.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of the fairy tale thing going on there. They're just, we're still really far away from the Brothers Grimm, though, even at their nastiest.
Yeah.
Although they could get pretty nasty, I guess. But, if you read some of those original stories, and you were kind of alluding to that earlier.
Yeah, same with Hans Christian Andersen and a lot of the other fairy tales.
Yeah, Hans Christian Andersen also wrote about the Sandman, and he was more benevolent, though.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it wasn't this horrible thing. So yeah, this story has been seriously influential, and there's a lot of material about this. None other than Sigmund Freud actually wrote about this story. It was one of the central axes on which his essay, "The Uncanny," was based in 1919. He said this about madness. He said, "The ordinary person sees that epilepsy and madness in the workings of forces hitherto unsuspected in his fellow man, but which at the same time he is dimly aware of in a remote corner of his own being." And he wrote about the childhood trauma that Nathaniel experienced, and how this shaped his entire life experience. I think that he couldn't really help but link it with his theme of like castration anxiety and so forth. But he didn't. He doesn't overstate it, but it's like it's the eyes to him, almost, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and
It's definitely a constant theme throughout the work.
Right. And so he did tie it in there, but there's actually something that I was looking into, like 100 years after he wrote that essay in 2019, there was a Sandman installation at the London Freud Museum, and it was actually kind of an updated version of the Sandman story and a representation of. I kind of have a little bit of a hard time figuring out from the text exactly what it looked like, because it was, I guess it was like the Freud household or something like that, almost.
Yeah, the pictures weren't very illustrative either.
Yeah, you said the pictures were bad,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's definitely supposed to take place in 1919 and not 1819. And they changed the story so that Nathaniel is actually a returning veteran of the First World War who has had scarring experiences, but also goes back to his childhood. And I don't know, there's even a Sandman app that said, that you can go on a tour of this house, and there's all this weird, there's this weird decor and sounds and music and songs and stuff like that. And then it's a bit of a cool artistic project, This story has been incorporated into a couple of operas. One that's almost like a Hoffman anthology opera. It's The Tales of Hoffman by Offenbach, which I'm not familiar with. I'm not really a devotee of opera. I don't know a lot about it. Although I did listen to some music for this episode. We already brought up the one thing, but there's something else coming up. It's kind of interesting. But and it's also, there's a ballet. called Coppelia that seems to be influenced by this, although not. I don't know. It seems to not really be interested in conveying the essence of the story. It's kind of different, but there's been like a lot of references in music and theater and stuff. Interestingly, Dario Argento is supposed to make a movie version, but that so far hasn't happened. It may not happen.
Yeah, he's kind of getting up there in years.
Yeah, he's getting up there, and his recent movies haven't been very good.
Yeah, I haven't really seen any of them. I think the last one I saw was maybe like Tenebrae or something like that, and that's not exactly very recent.
Oh, did you see Phenomena? You got to see that one at least.
No.
Okay, check that one out. But
okay.
yeah, there's good ones after that. But yeah, like I'm thinking more of the 2000s or something like that.
Yeah, right.
Some of them just haven't been very good. I think everything, kind of starting with his interpretation of Phantom of the Opera, it was really weird and not very good, and I don't know. So, and then the Three Mothers, like the last one came out finally, the sort of sequel to Suspiria, and I didn't really like that one either. It was like way more modern horror, kind of over the top. Like the old ones are over the top too, but
yeah,
there's something about the new way of doing over the top that I don't like as much.
Yeah, for sure.
Which sounds kind of hypocritical, but yeah, this movie was supposed to star Iggy Pop.
Oh, really? That's weird.
Yeah. I think maybe they would have put him in the Coppelius role.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that working, maybe. I don't know.
I don't know either. Like, they would have probably done crazy things to the story. There's a version of... Actually, I think his most recent thing was a version of Dracula, and apparently it's pretty much as far removed from Bram Stoker as you can get. I haven't seen it, but... So, yeah, it would probably be quite different. But... It might have been interesting to see Argento try his hand at something like that, because I enjoy his old movies, but unlike some of the other Italian directors, I kind of felt like he boxed himself into one thing too much.
Yeah.
Like, it's even when he tries to not do giallo, like it has a lot of the same. I don't know. It's just he tries to be more, like doing Phantom of the Opera and Dracula and stuff like that. But
where Fulci and Bava were pretty all over the place.
Yeah. And that's a good thing, because they were good at it, whereas I feel like, I don't know, like Argento has this limitation, but that's getting a bit off scope for this.
Right.
But, so any more thoughts on the Sandman?
No, I really like this one a lot.
Yeah, this was one of my favorites too, definitely. This story was just intense and dark, and the thing is, like, almost everybody, except maybe for Clara, was talking strangely a lot of the time. And it wasn't, oh, this is a weird translation. It was like deliberately, I don't know, just like the things that would come out of Coppelius's mouth, for instance, or Coppola, both of them, who may or may not be the same person. They're, kind of a doppelganger thing going on, maybe. Who knows, right? But it just... Every time, like, it just made you feel tense like Nathaniel did.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was kind of the idea. That was the intention behind it. And so I'll definitely be reading more Ernst Hoffman, because I was really impressed by that.
Yeah.
Now we have, we're going back to the United States, and... we're going to talk about a man named Fitz-James O'Brien, who's the writer of our third story of today, The Diamond Lens. His real name was Michael, and he changed it to Fitz-James after he moved to the United States. He was born in 1826 in Ireland, in Cork. He lived in England for a while, seemed to have been a bit of a loose spender, which is kind of a theme in the story, actually, where he kind of wasted all his money. Easily, and but somehow he was able to emigrate to the United States, and I think he did all right, because a lot of the Irish immigrants who came to the U.S. in like the early 1800s, they didn't do so good, and it didn't seem like it seemed he had enough money to cushion himself, and he lived in New York. He hung around the New York City artist scene. It's I don't know. There's not a lot of information about him. He wrote a bunch of short stories and some plays, one of which, The Gentleman from Ireland, seemed to do rather well. There wasn't a lot of stuff there, but a lot of the short stories do seem to kind of verge onto our subject matters here. He wrote for some kind of bigger magazines like the New York Times and the Atlantic Monthly. This one was actually published in the Atlantic Monthly magazine, which is, I think, still around, right?
Yeah, in some
Yeah.
form. A lot of those big literary magazines like Harper's and Atlantic and things like that have changed hands and have gone through different transformations, but in some capacity they're still existing.
Yeah, they managed to survive, and that's pretty cool. You
Yeah.
know, they have a certain amount of prestige and longevity to them now. But as we'll see, though, that doesn't necessarily equate to the quality of stories. Of this block, this is probably my least favorite story, but it was a
I
good
agree.
time.
Yeah.
But so in 1861, Fitz-James wanted to, he joined the Civil War effort, basically. He fought for the National Guard Regiment, and unfortunately, he got wounded, and he contracted tetanus in the hospital, and he died. He was pretty young. I think he was only 35. So, yeah, he didn't write any longer works, from what I can tell.
No, I think it was just a bunch of short stories.
Yeah, and I'm probably gonna read a couple more. There's been we noticed a couple of anthologies that have a few of his stories.
Yeah.
But this story, The Diamond Lens, was written in 1858, so that makes it one of the later stories and that we're doing today. And I'm gonna say maybe you can tell that because it does seem like maybe some conventions have been established now. He's also kind of writing in the Gothic tradition. I guess you could call it American Gothic, although
In a sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing specifically American about it.
No, I mean they do mention that he grew up in New England, then he went to New York for school, but aside from that, it doesn't really feel like a New York story.
No, not really. It doesn't play into it. So our main character is a guy called Linley. He's obsessed with microscopes. He's obsessed with microscopy. And not much else. His parents are really frustrated with him because all he really wants to do is look at stuff in the microscope. And it's really funny because it kind of reminded me of all these modern kids that just like want to look at TV all the time, except it's a microscope, which is such a different thing, right? But it's like, the whole association is completely different, and yet the reaction of the parents is exactly the same.
Yeah. He even steals Aunt's glasses to grind them down to make a lens.
Oh, yeah. But you can't blame them because, unfortunately, Linley he seems to have this problem where his focus is very narrow, and he doesn't seem to understand that in order to make use of his interest in microscopy, like he actually, has to study medicine or something like that, like, or maybe manufacturing or something so he can do something with it. And so, but I guess his parents are reasonably well off because they send him to school, and he says that he has a lot of money to basically pursue his hobbies, and he goes to New York, right? Like you said, he's from New England, that is. So he goes to New York, where there's a lot of interesting scientific tools and people he can talk to and learn from. Right?
Yeah, just a more well-developed academic community, more equipment, better laboratory environments, things like that.
Yeah, and one of the first things he does is buys. He just received this awesome new microscope as a gift. Well, actually, I guess it might have been a couple years before, but he has this microscope, and the first thing he does is buy a whole shit ton of accessories for it. I thought that was kind of funny because I didn't really realize in the 1850s there was a big thing for like a market for accessories, that he literally gives a list of like dozens of like attachments that you can buy for a microscope.
Right.
And that was kind of neat. But unfortunately, Linley doesn't yet have enough experience points to make use of all his new toys.
Mm-hmm.
So and he's supposed to be going to medical school, but he doesn't attend any of the lectures. He's a real slacker. I mean, and it comes out more and more as the story progresses, but you can kind of see it right from the beginning. And I'm not just saying this because he's a nerd, but our Linley is a real loser. Like, he's
yeah.
And so, meanwhile, Linley has a neighbor. This neighbor is a Jewish fellow named Jules, who loves jewelry. This guy, he describes this guy, and I kind of like the way he described him. Like, there were certain things that I didn't care for about this story, but
It's definitely a very anti-Semitic character. I mean, that's pretty on the nose with that.
Yeah, they were pretty on the nose, but I mean, I did like Fitz-James does have a certain flair for kind of wry description almost, and I thought that was pretty cool. But yeah, he's a very caricature of a person, really. His name is Jules Simon. The Lindley doesn't know a lot about him, but he has a lot of suspicions. Some of which might be unfounded, but it's probably, that he thinks that this guy is probably involved in the slave trade,
Hmm.
and that does turn out to be true.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
that's one of the things that he thinks about him, and it's probably the worst one, and it turns out to be true. So who knows what other nasty things this Jules Simon was up to, right? So, but interestingly enough, when Jules, who they kind of have a reasonably amicable relationship, it's kind of friendly, I guess. Jules, he says that he's gone to see a medium. This story really does have everything, folks. He goes to see this medium, and he's really excited by this, and he's telling Lindley about this experience he had. The medium's name is Madame Volpes, which sounds sort of ominous, maybe, but I don't know. We'll go with it. So now, unexpectedly, I think. I mean, I wasn't expecting this, but I didn't really understand the depths of Lindley yet, I guess. Lindley is very taken by this, and he's like, oh, I could learn something from this medium. Why don't I waste more of my parents' hard-earned money on making an appointment with her? And so that's exactly what he does. And, well, he has spent some time formulating his questions, and he writes down the name of the person that he wants to speak to from beyond the grave. I like the way O'Brien describes this like kind of seance, because it's very noisy and kind of like, whoa, okay. It's kind of over the top, but in a sort of sly way, almost. So the person that he wants to ask is Antony Leeuwenhoek, who is he's not the inventor of the microscope, but he was, responsible for basically perfecting the microscope.
Yeah. Pretty foundational figure in
Yeah,
microscopy.
yeah,
Microscopy.
microscopy, yes. He increased the magnification of the microscope tremendously, and perhaps even more important than that is that he actually used it to find a lot of things, and he was very creative with what he would put under this microscope, and he wrote a lot of documentation. It's a really interesting figure, actually. I wouldn't mind reading a story about him. I almost, I think that, well, O'Brien might have missed a trick, because Leeuwenhoek does speak to our narrator, and he says, to achieve your goal, this is what you must do. And that doesn't really seem like Leeuwenhoek's character from what I read about him. Like, he seems like the kind of guy who would have kind of laughed at him and taunted him, and, because he was kind of a showman scientist, one of the classic types, really. Oh, he wasn't malevolent about it or anything, but he enjoyed taunting the British Royal Society, like sending them tons of letters, telling them that he had so much better microscopes, and giving them like tantalizing pictures and stuff like that and whatnot. He was really, and the thing is, he lived a long time for the late 1600s, I think it was. He lived into his 90s, and he put in his will when he died that all his documents and designs should be given to the Royal Society. So in the end, he was like, yeah, I'll give it to you. But he was kind of holding on to it and being, very selective. And the thing is, it might be that O'Brien was trying to draw a parallel between Leeuwenhoek and this guy, but Leeuwenhoek was a much more rounded individual, and yes, he was obsessed with microscopy. The things that O'Brien describes Lindley doing are nothing compared to what Leeuwenhoek did. He scraped off bits of his skin. He examined shit and semen, and he was really, and he talked about all this. So Lindley seems like a bit of a flash in the pan compared to this guy, and Leeuwenhoek just kind of tells him what to do. Says he needs this really pure 140 karat diamond, and he needs to basically process it with electromagnetism for a while, and that could be his lens, and then he has to. I didn't really understand the bit about the hole, because that seems like a common microscope design.
Right. What he's doing here is he's piercing the diamond to form like an axis all the way through. And then he's going to use a diamond's magnification to look inside that. So it's kind of like a 3D hollow projector inside the diamond, or something like that.
I guess so. Yeah, that makes sense. So he has this. He needs to get this diamond. Well, he's very taken with his encounter with the medium. He's very happy, but he doesn't know where he's going to get a diamond. But what should happen when he gets home? But Jules has one. Isn't that amazing? But you know what? There's something about that, and that the story doesn't go into. Like, I don't know. There's a connection there that is just not made. Like, it's almost like he's taunting you with it, because he doesn't explain that there was a conspiracy or anything like that. It just so happens that, and I can't remember what Jules asked of the medium, or if that was even revealed. Did you notice that?
In regards to?
Well, Jules visited the medium, so presumably he asked something. Maybe it had to pertain to the diamond?
Oh, right. So he thinks that that's why he knows about the diamond, is that it was
Right.
like a very specific request that he needs a 140 carat diamond.
Well, yeah, and I'm just wondering how this connected to, did Jules reveal to her that he had this diamond?
I'm not sure.
I don't think O'Brien tells us. I think he doesn't say anything, so it's kind of left open, how she knows about this. Maybe she, I don't know, the spirit world really does seem to exist, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, there's this godly coincidence. And of course, he doesn't know right away that Jules has one, but it's really funny because Lindley, even though he is kind of a wimpy loser, he has a bit of a sense of humor, and he kind of confronts Jules because he's looking funny, like he's kind of looking through something and looking at something. He's like, "What are you looking at? A miniature lady?" And it's kind of funny. There's a bit of little foreshadowing there, and he's kind of teasing him, right? Because he's like, "Haha, this old guy is, he's probably looking at porn," right, or something. Well, it turns out he doesn't quite know right away, but it's sort of revealed by Jules that he has possession of this thing. The idea that Lindley has is that he's going to get Jules drunk, and he's going to take it from him. And at first he thinks, "Oh, I'll just steal it from him," but then he's like, "No, I'm going to have to kill him." And this is just something that he comes up with. There's no indication until now that he has any murderous tendencies, but
It escalates really quickly.
yeah, it's just all of a sudden, all right, I'm going to kill this guy. And he has this Raskolnikov moment where he kind of sits there justifying himself, and he's like, "Oh, he's a really bad Jew, and nobody would miss him," right? And it's pretty nasty. But when Jules gets drunk, though, he does start talking about how he came by the diamond, and it's a pretty nasty story. So I guess I don't know. I guess this is a good justification for what Lindley's going to do. Once Jules is in his cups on wine, Lindley puts a bit of laudanum in his wine, drugs him so he falls asleep, and then stabs him with a knife and makes it look like suicide. And this is never really touched on again.
Yeah, it works beautifully, and they ruled as suicide, and that's that.
Yeah, it's kind of a murder without a payoff, and I'm not saying that bad people shouldn't get away with, or necessarily get away with something, because it happens and it can be satisfying in a story, but it just seems to okay, that happened. So he has the diamond now, and nobody suspects his deed. And he processes it through the magnet and everything, and he grinds it up in its nice lens, and he builds this awesome new microscope. And sure enough, when he's looking through a drop of water, what should he see? In that drop of water, it is new awesome 3D projector. Say it with me. A beautiful lady. And yeah, she's this other nymph-like wonderful lady existing in this perfect natural landscape. And she just sort of seems to be hanging out there. Because I guess Lindley is the sort of person who could spend hours and hours looking through a microscope anyway. He has absolutely no problem becoming obsessed with a miniature lady who's probably obviously, hundreds of times smaller than a drop of water. And
she can't even perceive him being there. She's so small.
Right, exactly. And and then there's this funny scene where he kind of tries to convince himself that this is stupid. and he goes to a theater, and he's like has this intention that he's gonna kind of find the prettiest dancer in New York, and like he's been reading reviews and stuff like this, and he goes and he sees this, I guess it's a ballet performance or something like that, or some kind of dance theater, and the supposedly most beautiful supple dancer doesn't interest him in the slightest. Like he even finds her repugnant. So it's back to his little lady. He goes, but oh no! The little lady is old and withered and dying. What happened? Well, the drop of water evaporated. I'm sorry for giving away the ending of the story. I guess maybe, that's something that we should, like, perhaps be a little bit conscious of sometimes, is revealing spoilers, but you can't really not talk about it because, like, it's not a very satisfying ending.
Yeah.
But what else could you see coming, really? Like, unless the story is going to go into some totally weird, like, I now built a shrinking machine and was able to live in the drop of water, and I developed this new scientific principle, and it's not going to go there. So I kind of saw it coming before it did, and I don't think that there was really any other way to end it. So this story was kind of funny and predictable at the same time.
Yeah,
and sort of there were a couple, like. The murder scene was sort of well handled, but in the end amounted to sort of nothing.
Right, and that's the thing with, there's really no payoff or build up here. I mean, the woman he falls in love with, Anna Mula, dies as the water evaporates, and he goes mad, and that's the end of the story.
Yeah, he calls her Emma Kula.
Yeah, right. He kills this guy, nothing happens, and he's just pretty much a means to an end here of him indulging in this obsession.
And when his dream is gone, he pretty much, like, it describes, he's another one of those swooners into madness. He kind of, like, loses his mind for, like, several days.
Yeah.
And I was kind of expecting during that time his crime would be found out. But it just kind of says that he never recovered his sanity and kind of, I think, that was it.
Right.
Like, he never recovered his sanity, so I guess it doesn't matter if he was apprehended or not, because he's kind of round the bend anyway. And he was probably that way to begin with, because just, nothing that was described about this person was very together or enjoyable. Like, he was just kind of this sort of loser guy.
Well, the characters are both very one-dimensional. I mean, you have kind of this obsessive narrator who just cares about microscopy and will do literally anything
nothing else
to achieve that goal. And then you have this anti-Semitic caricature of a jeweler who's involved in the slave trade and has this ridiculously large diamond, just cuz. So there are all these, like, one-dimensional characters with no depth. There's really no arc and no payoff with any of the story's main events. But that said, it does have some interesting ideas as far as the science goes and how it portrays the apparatus of the microscopes and the construction of it, and how it kind of consumes the narrator in a way that we're going to see in later mad scientist manifestations as the trope builds up more throughout the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century.
Yeah. And he was another young man who was led astray.
Yeah.
Basically. And, I guess I could wish sometimes that the story had a bit more depth, but it didn't bother me. Like, it was kind of fun as an easy, quick read, I guess. And, it did have a little bit of that scientific basis, which was kind of neat. And references to Leeuwenhoek were kind of interesting because they made me want to, find out who this guy was and stuff. And it did incorporate a lot of the things of the time. Like, it could have been... normally the number of things that you would see in a longer work, like it had spiritualism, it had microscopy, it had murder, it had, references to the slave trade and all this other stuff. It didn't really go into detail about everything, but, it was a nice little hodgepodge, and this actually seems to be considered one of his most well-known stories.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if he gets too much better than this, but I want to read the story, What Was It? That sounds like it might be interesting, and it was written a little bit later, I believe, just before he entered the war.
Yeah, I know a couple of these, including this one, have appeared in various early sci-fi, early fantasy, early horror anthologies. But I don't know if he has too much recognition or reputation or influence beyond that, because he was killed quite young in the Civil War and didn't really have much of a chance to build up a literary reputation beyond
No,
these
he was
magazine
so
contributions.
eager to fight, knowing that it might kill him and everything.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, yeah. I mean, some people would say that's noble, I guess.
Yeah.
It's just kind of funny when you read, like, it looks like some people thought very highly of him, and we don't really know why. Like, maybe it's just he was a fun personality. I don't know.
Yeah.
He might have been, this fun, exotic Irish guy. He probably had a nice thick accent and everything, right?
Right.
So he impressed all the New York society ladies, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed there's a portrait of him. Would you say he's a handsome gentleman?
He's kind of odd looking, actually. At
Oh.
least if this picture is any. Kind of big bulging eyes and a silly mustache.
It is a portrait, not a photo, though, right? So,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know. Yeah,
it's
it could be
sketch.
slightly stylized, but
Right.
yeah. I mean, the photograph. That was like. We didn't talk about that because it didn't really seem that important, but I seemed that was an important element in even House of the Seven Gables, and that was pretty new at that time, the science of photography. So I don't know when you started seeing more photos than portraits of various figures, but
1860s, I would say. 1860s,
Yeah.
1870s when it really comes in.
so exactly around then, I
Yeah,
guess.
I think he would have been killed just before that really became a big thing. 'Cause there was quite a bit of photography taken during the Civil War,
Right.
but he didn't live very long through that.
Interesting. Well, that's the Diamond Lens. There's not really a ton to say about it. It was a cool story, kind of funny, like unintentionally funny, unlike the one story that we're getting to next block, which is deliberately funny in many parts.
Mm-hmm.
This one kind of was like a cheesy B movie kind of funny, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
it really does have that mad scientist archetype, which I think it does have a lot in common in that respect with the previous two stories, Sandman and Rappacini's daughter.
Yeah, definitely. Certainly less, less depth that makes you kind of keep thinking about it or wondering about it, but it's
Right.
a lot of the same themes.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right, so I think it's time for us to take a break and refresh our drinks and our palates, and we'll be back with the next block of stories after this brief interlude. All right, we are back. We, the Chrononauts. We are sticking with the United States of America for the beginning of this second block of stories. And we are going to talk about, well, we're not really going to talk too much about the man because there really isn't a lot of information about him that seems to be available. But we're going to talk briefly about somebody named James Davenport Whelpley. He was born in New York City in 1817. And he was a physician. So here is a guy that actually has some scientific experience. Not only was he a physician, he actually had to give up his practice at some point because he was not a very physically healthy man. And I don't know if some aspects of that made it difficult for him to practice. It's not really clear on that. But he did go more into the study of acoustics and physics later on in life, which is kind of interesting. I don't know how much money he made from being a doctor, but it was kind of weird. It seemed like he might have made quite a bit because apparently he bought a newspaper in San Francisco, and he tried to start a colony in Honduras in 1849.
Yeah, it wasn't clear what nature of that commercial venture was from the source that I have.
To be honest, his bio is really strange. Like,
Yeah.
there's something about it that just it's not that it doesn't add up. It just seems like, how did that happen? So apparently he wanted to start this business colony or something in Honduras. And while he was there, he met this William Walker guy and ended up being kidnapped. This guy was somebody who was interested in starting an English colony, English-speaking colony in South America,
Right.
and
He
he
basically wanted to establish a slave state in Central and Latin
Central
America,
America, yeah,
and in Honduras he maintained this like rogue operation for several years, and he was eventually caught and executed.
he
But
actually took over the government of Nicaragua for like a year.
yeah,
It's
so
apparently,
it's kind of interesting that the timing here is that these attempted slave states they tried to build all kind of collapsed before the start of the American Civil War. So if they had been in existence at the time and they were able to provide either military alliance or some kind of financial aid to the Confederacy, what course of action that would have had on how the
yeah.
war played out. Fortunately for all of us, that the states collapsed here and that Walker was shot by
Well,
firing squad.
it looks like a bunch of armies in various South or Central American places got together and kind of defeated him. His group was called the Filibusters, and I guess that's where that term came from. Here,
Yeah, it means something completely different in modern U.S. political terms, where somebody, senator or representative, goes up and blathers on for 10 or 11 hours to just clog up the proceedings. But a filibuster in this context was basically a mercenary soldier and a kind of rogue army operating without the guidance of the state. So they were looking to establish essentially their own state, and slavery was a specific point that they wanted to port
yeah.
into Nicaragua and Honduras and other Central American
So
regions.
bloody hell, guys, what are you doing? Just stop, right? So apparently, Mr. Walker, or sorry, Mr. Whelpley, managed to get away from there somehow.
Yeah, he escaped. The bio again says no idea how he escaped. He
No,
somehow got from Central America to San Francisco. I'm sure the escape was very daring and filled
yeah,
with.
and you got to think like the reason he was kidnapped was because he was a doctor, and he was actually forced to start, presumably, practicing medicine for
Wounded soldiers, I'd
battle.
imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, and you got to think that because he stopped doing that in New York because his health was bad. This probably really sucked for him, like a
Hmm.
lot. So he got away from there, and when he got back to the United States. He lived in San Francisco for a while and then moved to Boston, and he devoted the rest of his life to literature and science, mostly the study of acoustics and vibration. He seems to have written a few stories.
Yeah,
No, again, like O'Brien, not a lot, and probably not a lot that's linked to science fiction in any way. But the titles of some of these stories do sound interesting, and I will open by saying that I like this story enough that I'm curious to see kind of what else he would do.
yeah, pretty much all of his fiction was written between 1857 and 1862, so after he escaped from filibuster kidnapping.
Right.
Pretty much everything looks like it was published in Harper's except for one story that was in the Atlantic. He did serve as one of the editors for the American Whig Review in the 1940s, so before his kidnapping, where he did have some nonfiction political writings and history. I don't know if you call it sociology, but just kind of a survey of foreign countries and religions and things like that.
Interesting.
But from what I can tell, all of his fiction was written in the later portion of his life.
Yeah, and there are definitely some titles that sound interesting, but yeah, again, he died of tuberculosis, I believe. So he was
Yeah.
another, it's he had lung. I think that his health issues were perhaps related to his lungs. He did have a daughter who became a pioneering aviator in the U.S., and she was also responsible for some other things. She was into
He helped
designing.
develop camouflage, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's pretty cool. He was married twice. His first wife died like a year after they got married, so that's also pretty sad. And then he didn't really waste much time in getting married a second time. So we're talking about his story, "The Atoms of Chladni."
Chladni.
Chladni. Yeah. I don't know. It's weird. Chladni. This is definitely German, but the story for some reason Whelpley refers to him as a Frenchman. I didn't really get
Yeah,
that.
so the word Chladni means cold in pretty much every Slavic language. Chladni refers to the scientist Ernst Chladni, who was a citizen of the Habsburg Empire, but I think he was Slovak by nationality. So it's kind of that mixture of Slavic and Germanic cultures under the empire.
Yeah. Well, He was also an acoustic pioneer, apparently.
Yeah,
So he's responsible for kind of measuring the speed of sound and stuff.
right. Basically, figuring out that sound is a wave that vibrates through the air, and his experiments were revolving around trying to figure out, exactly how that happened and exact how they propagate through the air. He did his experiments, I think, around the turn of the century, in the early 1800s, late 1700s. The founder of modern acoustics from a mathematical standpoint wouldn't come for a couple years later. That's Hermann von Helmholtz, who wrote a seminal paper in 1863, which basically sketches out in very explicit mathematical terms that all sounds, whether they be extant or theoretical, can be created by the combination or subtraction of any given number of sine waves. So that kind of forms the beginning of all modern sound acoustic synthesis. But Chladni did some very early experiments, and was quite known at this time. Whelpley here picked up on, had him serve as an inspiration for this story.
Yeah, it does tie into the story quite a bit, and that's cool. There's some neat hidden background behind this, and what I find interesting too. I mean, maybe people did kind of have vague ideas about this stuff at the time, but it's not like you could just do what we do and look up on the internet
Yeah, no.
some reference, right? So, and there's actually a lot in this story, and you can tell that Whelpley is he's got his finger on the pulse of many new developments and stuff, and it's pretty cool. So there's an unnamed narrator who has a friend named P. I called him P-Funk in my notes. I don't know if we want to stick with that, but he's actually a really annoying guy, so he's not cool like P-Funk. Like, he's kind of, he likes to say really obnoxious things. He kind of made several notes about this guy being really obnoxious, so I don't know. But
he's constantly referred to as a savant, so I'm not exactly sure what he means by that.
Yeah, right, exactly. I noted that too. What does that mean? What is that exactly? What does it sound like? The scientific laugh?
Right.
What's that? So through him, he meets this guy named Gustav Mahler, which made me do a double take, because there's obviously, that's the name of a composer that wouldn't have been known yet, as I had to check on that just to make sure I wasn't off with my dates, and Whelpley wasn't making some sly comment, but I think it's a coincidence. It is spelled differently, but it's still a little bit strange.
Yeah.
So anyway, he is an inventor, this Mahler guy. He makes all kinds of weird machines, and the way he describes this is really interesting because there are some pretty far out machines, and this Mahler is kind of a weird cat. He seems to think that he's in contact with spirits. He talks about them like they're his friends almost.
Specifically, the spirit of Chladni he claims to be in touch with.
Yeah, very much so. And he makes allusions to different things. Like there's he says that a lot of this stuff is coming, and he's working on it, and there's various machines. There's something that's like a lie detector, apparently. He doesn't really go into detail to describe it, but it's one of the things he's come up with. So our narrator finds this sort of fascinating, and I don't remember how they chanced to meet, but he ends up meeting Mahler's wife. I can't remember how that transpired exactly.
He, the savant, knows them both, and I think sets up an interview somehow.
Okay, yeah. So his wife is an interesting character. She's a very social lady. She's like, again, what we were talking about earlier with the society ladies. She seems to be one of those women who her chief occupation is having friends. And Whelpley sounds a little bit cynical about this, but a lot of this comes from the point of view of the P character, who has some really misogynistic things to say, like, to say the least. He's like, one thing I hate more than scientific women is womanish men. Like,
yeah, right.
There's actually a lot of good quotes in this story that are sometimes good for the wrong reasons, but you kind of feel like Whelpley knows that, right? And it's, so there's a lot. There's good quotes here about several different things, and you can kind of see why it was published in a maybe what term a literary magazine, just because there is some interesting observation and stuff like that about human character and whatnot. She recounts the story of her marriage to this Mahler guy, who we already know actually ended up in an asylum. I think that's revealed really early on in the story.
Yep.
So
it pretty much opens up that he's
dead. Right,
And
that's the opening line. He
yeah,
died in the asylum.
yeah,
So we already know this. He was obsessed with his inventions. Meanwhile, he has this friend named Bonzal, who's like a shady lawyer guy. I guess he's his legal counselor or something. It's not really gone into why they're friends because they don't seem like they would have a lot in common. But whatever, they are. But this Bonzal is a really evil character, and Mahler is too obsessed with inventing and doing science to really understand. He doesn't pay attention to his wife either. And I said that his wife was an interesting character, and so far, out of all the stories that we've read for this entire podcast, I would say that there's hints here that she's probably the strongest female character that we've had yet.
yeah.
Which makes it a shame that the story's maybe not a little bit more together. But she really is. She's very canny. She's very smart. You kind of like... It's interesting because P has all these erroneous thoughts about her, but the more time our narrator spends with her, the more he kind of likes her. And unlike some of the other characters that we've come up with so far, he's not like ridiculous in love, falling over himself or anything. He's just like, yeah, she's cool. She knows what's happening. But it's pretty sad because, I mean, you can tell she really does enjoy her husband, but he hasn't, he's barely been to see her for like a year. He hasn't spent any time with her at all. She has money somehow. He's an inventor who most of his inventions haven't really come to pass yet. So again, he's one of these like struggling scientist archetypes. He's also maybe a little bit adrift because apparently he can only speak German. And so he's a little bit like at a disadvantage maybe in the society that he finds himself in.
Yeah, I think this is supposed to be New York, right?
Yes. I guess Mrs. Bertoldi, who's his yeah. So she actually, I mean, she's kind of like obviously her English is perfect, and she speaks German too. She's probably fluent in multiple languages. So and he's probably should be very grateful that he has her. But this Bonzal has some funny ideas about getting all this money, and she wants to use him to get her money. She has developed this machine, and it's probably the one invention that seems closest to working. And it is a machine that can record human speech and translate it into text.
Yeah, it's really interesting how it's described too. He uses the principles of the atoms of Chladni, the kind of acoustic experiments, so sound vibrating through the air, and he has these like plates hooked up to the ceiling, and he claims he's using them to spy on his wife. So the machine would pick up vibrations and somehow know how to interpret them by using needles that punch holes through pieces of paper in a similar fashion that punch card notation would be used in early computers. There's a French invention from earlier in the 1800s called the Jacquard loom, which used similar principles of punch card notation to do loom art. So each pixel would either be off or on, and then with that kind of monochrome pixel design, you can make an entire tapestry. So this somehow is able to process and interpret speech patterns into sounds, punch them into paper, and then that paper serves as a notation for a written transcript of what's being said. So essentially a fancy way of making a speech-to-text dictation machine.
So let's hope it works better than Google.
Yeah.
Because essentially what's happening is that he's using this device to spy on his wife, and he wants a divorce because he's sure that his wife has been seeing another person, and he has all these notebooks to prove that. And I guess he intends to use these in a legal capacity, maybe?
Yeah.
Which I don't know. I see a lot of problems with that.
Yeah, there's like a forged will and all this other stuff. But, it turns out the lawyer's playing them both against each other, and the lawyer forged all of the things that she said, so it's really all a fake.
Yeah, and you got to think, like, if this evidence was introduced and somebody said, oh, this was recorded by machine, like, the next question would be,
right.
Well, how is this, like, how can we prove that this really happened, right?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, like, so At first, he says he wants a divorce, but then he kind of turns around and changes his tune. But to complicate things further, Mahler's wife also has this friend named Montague, who's kind of like wise to a little bit of what's going on, but maybe not necessarily wise to the affection that she might feel for him. Perhaps.
Yeah.
I don't know. But he, he's like, oh, she's like, they're both trying to scam you and all this, and they're both like, and it turns out that they make off with all her documents and make copies of them. So, like, I don't know. She's kind of like, yeah, it's obvious that the lawyer has this in mind, and Mahler is just oblivious, kind of like, it doesn't really seem to even. It barely registers with him.
No, he's totally oblivious because he's completely absorbed in his invention. He wants to build this machine, and he doesn't realize the lawyer's robbing him blind. He doesn't know anything that's going on in his life. He's completely focused on his work. And I think that's a major theme of the story, even though it takes up a very small percentage of, the actual text, is him just being this kind of fool in a sense, because he can't really function in the real world at all. He's just so absorbed in building something, and there's not even really a purpose behind it beyond spying on his wife. I mean, that's what this thing is built for.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, you would think that he would have a grander purpose in mind, but I genuinely don't know. And, this is one of the reasons why this story was so frustrating for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you describe in brief detail a little bit how you think the plot unraveled? Like, how did he fail, this lawyer fail, and other than the obvious reasons why you would think that this plot wouldn't work?
The whole idea that he forged the documents, Maria figures it out almost instantly and says, this is bullshit. I can show you why it's bullshit. And then the lawyer tries to blame Mueller, and it's this like really complex thing where he's trying to talk his way out of it, but he doesn't, and then he kills himself by stepping on the current wire that leads to the machine and fries himself, and then
it's like the power of 60 cells.
Yeah,
apparently.
right.
So it's pretty heavy electric charge, I guess.
Yeah. And then Mueller comes in, and he's like totally in the dark to the fact that Bonsall has been forging all of these documents. Bonsall basically accused Mueller of having a hand in it and orchestrating it himself, which Mueller didn't. So him and his wife kind of reconcile, but I think that the whole experience drives him mad. He goes into the asylum, he dies there, and then the story says that she dies shortly thereafter, though it's not really clear
I know.
why
the reconciliation was meaningless. He probably still wouldn't have sex with her.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I don't know. Like, this story was really... it frustrated me a lot because it was almost really awesome. Like, the writing was really good. There were some really nice quotes. There were, like, it had a lot of very modern elements. There's at one point, I think it's Montague. He kind of brings up this detective, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, we were talking about him earlier, and he's like some character out of a 1940s, like...
Oh, yeah, he's totally the guy in the trench coat and the hat, sneaking under the shadows and things like that. Yeah, he's such a stock character from 40s, 50s noir. This, like, character that the lawyer Bonsall hires to spy on Maria.
Sorry, it was Bonsall, right? Okay, sorry, I got that. I got Montague, but
so the spy guy comes and like he's harassing Maria, but Montague is there, and they confront the spy, and they're like, what the fuck? But he's just like really sketchy, shady, like thug character who has a bad criminal reputation, and
he probably makes stuff up for money.
Right. He definitely feels like a character out of a gangster movie or a noir thriller or something like that.
Yeah, and you didn't see guys like that. Like, I mean, shit, man. Sherlock Holmes wasn't really even a thing yet.
Right. No, it wouldn't be for a couple decades, I don't think.
Right, and that's a very different kind of detective, right? We haven't seen too many of the sleazy detective types. He's even referred to as a vampire at one point.
Several times, actually.
Several times, yeah.
I think more than his actual name, which is Mr. Cragg.
Mr. Cragg, yeah, that's... That's the name of the really intense demiurge character in A Voyage to Arcturus. So that kind of, that had a little bit of a click with me because
Yeah,
that's a really nasty, weird character too.
yeah,
But anyway, Atoms of Chladni. Well, you know, I feel like the story could have either been longer or maybe gone over again because it just seemed like everything about it wanted to lead my mind sort of in the wrong direction a little bit and made me go like, oh, what about this part? What about this? Like,
right.
what does this mean, right? And in the end, it kind of means nothing. And it's a little bit frustrating because I could tell that there was a germ of something really good here.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of those, B-grade Italian thrillers where they introduce a lot of elements, especially the quabbling over wills and forging documents, and everybody's trying to get everybody's money, but they introduce either too many plot elements, or the plot elements don't make sense, or the characters' motivations are all weird. So nothing really comes together at the end. It just feels like a bunch of things happening in sequence. There's really no kind of overall arching arc here.
Yeah, and the ending is very unsatisfying.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, and it's not like I wanted them necessarily to live happily ever after, but it just seems like Bonzo killed himself without. I mean, obviously it sucks that his plan collapsed for him, but I don't
He
know.
could have got
Like,
away with it. I mean, if
he
the
could
guy
have
from
got
the
away with
diamond
it.
lens could have stabbed that guy through the heart, this guy could have,
Yeah, there's some interesting sexual like dynamic here between men and women. Like I think that Whelpley is almost trying to comment on that a little bit.
Mhm.
He seems to be, at one point, he's talking about the difference between the way men and women look at certain things, and he does it in a very, and even though his P-Funk guy is pretty much a misogynist, Whelpley doesn't really come off that way. Like, he doesn't necessarily seem to like it, but he does say this one thing, and I guess maybe this sums up the essence. I think it's sort of Whelpley himself speaking, and he says the instinct of a woman, correct in appreciating where and motives, fails always in sounding the complicated and strategic depth of masculine perfidy. So, basically he's saying men are prone to be liars, and sometimes, I mean, obviously, though, it's a little bit one-sided because Mahler really falls for it too, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just Maria, and really Mahler's not, you know, he's just obsessed. He's mostly oblivious. He doesn't seem to actually know much about what Bonzo is planning.
Yeah.
So
No, that was actually Maria that said that when she was recalling her
there's
story
Maria.
to
Okay,
the
good.
narrator.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that makes sense. That makes sense. And she does, at first she's kind of convinced that her husband's really in on it. So, and later on, she kind of realizes he's kind of not. He's pretty, yeah, like we said, he's not clear on any of what's going on. He
Yeah.
just has his obsession, and he's another blind scientist, I guess.
Yep. Pretty much.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's one theme that really ties together many of the stories here, is that archetype that we're seeing coming out, probably inspired by Frankenstein and popularity of that
Right.
story. I mean, aside from Hoffman, which predates it by 2 years, but
Oh, yeah.
something like this, or in
The Hawthorne
particular,
stories.
yeah, the Hawthorne stories. I think you really can feel that influence there.
Yeah, and it's a cautionary tale about human character rather than about science, because I think everybody acknowledges that science can be really, really awesome and good,
Yeah,
but that, as usual, people screw it up, and I mean, that would be a Hawthorne thing for sure.
right.
Because, like, when I see, like, Hawthorne joined the socialist utopia, like, that's not him.
Yeah,
He's not going to last there because, he doesn't believe in the innate human goodness, right? Like, he just doesn't. And he believes that humans are relatable and understandable, but not good. Like,
right.
not, and
Yeah.
he thinks that they need something else to focus them. And I think that Hoffman may be a bit like that too. Like, he thinks maybe for Hoffman it's art. For Hawthorne, it may be too, that there's a certain amount of discipline that's required, maybe.
Mhm.
I don't know. Like, in order to, yeah, like, and, we got our guy in the diamond lens who's, like, so narrow minded. He doesn't even really understand science.
Well,
Yeah.
he's almost a pure sociopath.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I guess we can pretty much not put him in with the trends in the
Yeah.
sense that he was willing to do all kinds of stupid things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, it's an interesting one. Would I recommend it? Well, kind of. It's a well-written story. Nate, I think you're right. It does kind of remind you of these weird family plot thrillers. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
It's just there's a lot of things that you feel like you missed something even when you didn't, almost.
Mhm.
So yeah, and it's a kind of a frustrating feeling, and it's not the story that I disliked the most, but it's the story that frustrated me the most because I wanted it to be better.
Yeah. In a sense, it's more interesting than good, because
Yeah.
it does cover some. I guess at this point, it's being a little well worn, the whole mad scientist trope and somebody who's like totally absorbed in their work
Yeah.
and unable to communicate with the outside society.
Yeah.
But
And he tries to do something more literary with it, but he doesn't
He
take
does.
it far enough.
yeah, but I think the discussion of acoustics and the idea of speech and sound as it's processed as bits of information is something that's really interesting and kind of really forward thinking for the time.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. When was the phonograph?
1877 was the
Okay.
phonograph, but there was a device earlier called the phone autograph, which could
Oh.
only record sound. So this was basically
Sound waves.
Yeah, it was a needle etching stuff into like a very thin metal, like tin foil or something like that,
Right.
which was invented in 1857. So this couldn't play anything back, but it did transcribe sound waves into a medium. Whereas the phonograph, as invented by Thomas Edison, was the first device to be able to actually play back the recorded sound.
And we're still a long way from speech to text.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even in 2020, it's got a bit of ways
Yeah,
to go.
it's not good enough to use in the court. Sorry. It's just not.
Yeah.
So, let alone, a forgery would have to introduce all the kind of errors. And yeah, I don't know. It's just he was forward thinking, but not enough to think about repercussions, perhaps, of that.
Yeah.
Although, again, if the story had been longer and more involved, I think he would have got there.
Yeah.
So that is the ultimate shame of the Atoms of Chladni experience.
Well, maybe his other fiction stacks up a little better.
Yes. So why don't we move on now to a writer who is probably, other than Hawthorne, our other very famous writer of literature. We're moving now to France, and we're going to talk about Honoré de Balzac. Nate, why don't you tell us a bit about Balzac?
Sure. So he is one of the major figures of 19th century French literature, and in my personal opinion, the best 19th century French author. He was born in 1799 and died in 1850, but was a absurdly prolific author. Pretty much all of his works compose of a large body of work called the Human Comedy, which contains 91 finished works. So these are novels, novellas, and short stories, as well as 46 unfinished works. The entire sequence begins in 1829, and he pretty much wrote the entirety of his life after that point on this. He wrote extremely fast and all the time and was basically a workaholic. As far as I know, this is the first kind of shared universe type work.
Wow.
So all of the novels have some kind of greater connection to one another. Characters are reused and appear in different stories, so a major character in one work will be a minor background character in another.
That's a great way to sell books.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's other cool things about it, but you can tell that was part of, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
As far as I can tell, there's nobody who does something this big before this. So Zola was another major French author, and in my opinion, the number 2 of 19th century France, but he wrote in the latter half of the 19th century.
Yeah, and he did a similar thing.
He did
right?
something similar, yeah. And then this is common all the time in like modern fantasy and things
Nowadays,
like that.
oh yeah.
But yeah, But Faulkner did this in the 1920s and 30s with his fictional Mississippi County. But here we have Balzac doing this in France over the course of 20 years. The first novel in the series to really use this technique was Old Goriot, which was written in 1834 and 1835, which I think is probably his most well-known work in the English-speaking world anyway. I never encountered Balzac until well after high school and college, but I'm sure people that grew up in French-speaking parts of the world would encounter him very early. But at least over here, I think Old Goriot is his most known work, which is kind of his take on King Lear, where somebody's ruined by his own children.
Much to my shame, I have not read any Balzac until now.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of it to read, and I have loved pretty much everything I've read by him. I've read 4 of his novels, then around a dozen of the novellas, including this one. The one we read for this time was Gambara, which was written in 1837. So, like pretty much all of his other novels and works, Gambara is interlinked within human comedy. So, 2 very minor characters who show up at the end are the major characters of the short story Massimiliano, which I have not read, but he is a big fan of doing things like that. So totally throwaway characters that seem completely inconsequential to the plot are given this added shade of depth by appearing in other works, and I think it's a really cool thing that he does.
It's really crafty.
Yeah.
And it's a very modern technique of getting people hooked, and if you're a popular enough author, you can make it work. And you see all these like guys going all gaga over Isaac Asimov's Robot Cycle, and you're like, oh yeah, well, what about Honoré de Balzac and his Humédie Comédie Humaine?
Yeah,
Right?
he's one guy that definitely needs a fandom wiki, because sometimes keeping all the characters and works straight is a bit of a challenge. Though fortunately, somebody did compile a list of all the Balzac characters that appear in more than one work, so there's that kind of handy reference there. But his works were massively influential, not just in France, but abroad as well. Dickens, in particular, cited him as a huge influence. Of course, later French authors, Zola, Flaubert, and Proust were extremely by Balzac. So the proliferation of his works outside of France lead to some dodgy translations at times. There are certainly multiple translations of Gambara in the public domain. Some of the translations are Bowdlerized, though he didn't get hit nearly as bad as Zola did by the censors. The one we read for this time was pretty good. That's on Project Gutenberg. I compared it to another translation I have, which was published in a Walter Black anthology novellas, and it's a very similar translation, just reads a little clunkier in English. I think the one that we read does pretty good. So the actual story itself, like a lot of Balzac's stories, involves scheming characters in Paris trying to either get somebody out of their money or get somebody out of their wife. In this case, it is somebody trying to break up a marriage. So the character we're following for most of the story is Count Andrea Marcosini, who is an exiled Milanese noble that arrives in Paris. And upon arriving in Paris, he immediately is taken by a girl who's walking through the crowd and starts stalking her. So he keeps following her through the city, and he's very deliberately trying to keep out of sight. And
being very creepy about it.
Yeah, right. He's definitely a creep.
Yeah.
And he arrives at this Italian restaurant, which is fortunate for him because he's Italian.
He's Italian.
Yeah, so
and he probably misses his homeland's food.
Yeah, exactly. So the cook there is a pretty ridiculous character, and he's giving Andrea the story about the girl, and he reveals that he's the wife of this mad composer named Gambara, who earns absolutely nothing and then has to be taken care of basically like a child by his wife. And all of his money goes into these crazy instruments that make this awful racket. And Gambara's experimental music compositions are contrasted throughout the entire story with the Italian chef, who himself left Italy. He claims that he was commercially unsuccessful in his restaurants because his experimental dishes were too complex for the taste of the common people. And now
so he
just
basically got hounded out of the country.
Right, exactly. But now he has to cook common food just for the craft of it. But it's Gambara makes a quip later that he was actually accused of poisoning a whole bunch of people because his food was so bad.
Yeah.
So
and the people that eat at his restaurant are always kind of joking about it too.
Yeah.
But they're actually not very well off, so they're probably just happy they can eat a decent meal.
Right,
But
and I think there's some comfort in being around Italians and your home countrymen and a foreign land, especially when your country
yeah,
was probably destroyed 20 years prior by the Napoleonic Wars, which really sent most
right.
of continental Europe in an upheaval.
Now, this story was very specifically, I think, set in 1831. I
Yeah.
don't really know a lot about this, but maybe you do. There seemed to be a lot of sort of digs at the Italians. I wonder, were Italian, or were Italy and France kind of at odds around this Napoleon III sort of
I'm not exactly sure
timeline?
about this period, but there are Italian characters that pop up in some of the other Balzac works I've read. In particular, there's one called The Vendetta, and it follows these passionate Italian characters who are willing to get in a duel at a moment's notice and all of this. So I think, like other depictions we've seen of Southern Europeans and some of the other stories we've read, the Hawthorne and the Hoffman, they're kind of portrayed as these, impulsive
Yeah.
people.
The Italians, not so much the French, though.
Right, yeah.
Right, yeah. Because
Yeah,
French people are awesome, right?
of course,
Yeah. Sorry, continue. I didn't mean to divert you. I just wanted to know if you had any ideas about... Because I was curious about the digs against the Italians. It just kind of made me... Yeah.
Yeah. Gambara is pretty much considered a joke by everybody who patrons this restaurant, or I should say frequents this restaurant. And he eventually comes in while the Count is there, and the Count begins to chat him up to try to get in with his wife, basically. Gambara's music is insulted by pretty much everybody in the tavern, but Andrea comes to his defense, and they get into this really long discussion about Beethoven. And they're both really big fans of Beethoven, and that's kind of a running theme throughout the entire story.
It's his way in.
Yeah, right. So he kind of butters him up, praising Beethoven and attacks Rossini, really championing the contemporary German music. So Gambara begins to tell him his story, that he was the son of an instrument maker and performer. He learned music at a very early age, but his family, like many other families during the time, were ruined by the war, and they spent life wandering around doing odd sound jobs for theaters and things like that. So his main aim in life was to discover the physical laws of sound, not the mathematical ones, which he says are perfected by people like Mozart and Beethoven. So what he's referring to here is how chords stack together and note progressions and scales and things like that. What he wants to do is discover how sound is actually generated. So how a piano makes a sound, how a horn makes a sound, how a violin makes a sound. He says, we know that they do make a sound, but we don't know why. So that's essentially what he's aiming to get at here. And he explicitly says, if we knew what that process was, science and art would both be gainers. Whatever extends science enhances art. So he wants to create these new musical instruments that will kind of expand the possibilities of composed music. So throughout his journey here, he has written 2 operas. His first, The Martyrs, was a commercial failure. Around this time, he marries Mariana, who is the woman that was being followed by Andrea, being pursued by Andrea. They eventually end up in Paris, and Gambara says it has the nastiest character and the nastiest people that he's ever met in his life compared to some of the other places he's been to where they have a more welcoming environment. Mariana works as a seamstress for the prostitutes that frequent their district. They pretty much live a meager life of poverty while he's tinkering around with his musical instruments. So Andrea's kind of moved by this story, offers to set them up in new lodgings to continue to gain favor with his wife.
But he has this really personal talk with Mariana first.
Yeah.
It's like a bit too personal, maybe.
Right. And he kind of gets her to admit and sees that she was never really in love with him, but he was kind of more of a lost cause that she hangs on to. They kind of establish that Gambara's not really in the picture. He's kind of going to be cast aside. Yeah. So Andrea goes with the cook to check out their apartment, and he's immediately struck by the chaos and the craziness of the apartment. All of the musical instruments everywhere, and everything is kind of disheveled, and Gambara is really excited to show him his second opera, which is an opera about the life of Muhammad. So he goes through and describes the entire plot of the opera in very rich detail, including
love
chord
this.
changes and things like that.
He was totally enraptured.
Yeah, right. He's just kind of like whipping that out super fast on his traditional instruments. And since he's going so fast and explaining things in terms that,
He's playing the piano.
yeah,
right,
that neither the cook or Andrea can understand, they're like totally lost, and they think it's
and
just
it
this,
sounds
like
like
this, yeah, right,
chaos.
this like discordant, grotesque music.
He just sort of describes the intervals they uses, and it sounds like it's like simple almost. Like it almost makes me think, it's simple and pounding. Like, and he uses a lot of really obvious intervals almost, like fifths and stuff.
Mhm.
And it's kind of, I mean, it's been a while since I really studied music theory, but it sounds like, it sounds not classical at all.
Yeah, yeah.
And very probably distasteful to everybody in the room.
Right, and that's how it's described as being very disgraceful. Afterwards, he goes to show the panharmonicon, which is the instrument that he's been working on his entire life, basically. But he gets pissed off that the cook is there and has him leave. So he can't play with him present, but once he's gone, he shows it to Andrea. Panharmonicon is a instrument that simulates an entire orchestra, so including the human voice, strings, woodwinds, all of that. So Andreas sees that he has a great fondness for booze as well as music, so he liquors him up a bit, and then Gambara just plays the most beautiful, breathtaking music he's ever heard on the Panharmonicon. Presumably the opera of Muhammad, played how it was meant to be heard, and he's just totally blown away by this. And afterwards, they get him drunk again, and they take him to an opera that's currently being performed in Paris, Robert Le Diable. And while Gambara is there and he's drunk, he's like really, really into it. And he gets like totally inspired by it and starts like recreating pieces of it on his instruments. And Andrea tells him, in the midst of all this, you should really be a poet, not a musician. This music stuff isn't for you.
It was really bad advice.
Yeah.
It actually really messed up Gambara big time.
Yeah.
Because he was really in the moment, and he was actually praising somebody else's work.
Yeah.
Because he had many drinks by then.
Yeah.
So he was in whatever zone that brings him to.
Yeah.
Right. And I actually listened to the opera, incidentally. It's pretty heavy.
Yeah, I listened to a bit of it. There's a full performance on YouTube that's like pro shot. Video camera quality is good. Sound quality is great. I think the whole thing is like 3-4 hours or something like that.
It's pretty long. Yeah.
I mean, most operas are not known for being short, but
that's right. Yeah. But it was very. It was unusually. There was a lot of dissonance. There was a lot of weird sound. Because it's very much like it's a very dark, satanic kind of opera.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I didn't look too much into the story behind it.
No, I didn't either.
It's a bit tangential, but it's a very, it's heavy as hell.
Yeah. And it's there if you want to listen to it, which is always cool.
And you should, because it's an example of if you wanted to, tell people, hey, man, not everything in the 1800s is like, nice and sweet music, right? There's some pretty heavy, weird stuff, even then.
Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah.
So after this, Gambara swears off booze forever, and he says that the opera only sounded good because he was drunk, and that his own music is far better, and that the opera basically plagiarized from a bunch of whole other works. So he basically tells Andrea off and basically spends his entire life, again, with his head in his musical instruments. So they do a time skip. 6 years later, he's financially ruined. His panharmonicon is sold by public auction. His wife left him, and his operas were also sold by public auction, so he has nothing. So Mariana comes back to the Italian restaurant. It's revealed that Andrea had left Mariana after the two presumably shacked up together. And then Mariana...
He basically ruined her.
Yeah, right.
He turned her into an old maid, basically.
Yeah, he used her, got what he wanted, and left her. Like a lot of characters in Balzac novels do. There are a lot of really bad people in Balzac novels.
Yeah.
And that's one thing he writes really well, is he is a really good author at writing characters and people that feel really three-dimensional, which is, I think, a really welcome change from some of the other things like Diamond Lens.
Diamond Lens for
But
sure. Yeah.
a lot of the characters he writes are just really, really rotten people that are out to screw everybody over, and they don't care why or how petty. They'll ruin somebody financially or break up marriages or ruin families and things like that. It's a common theme throughout his work.
Yeah. The funny thing is that he started out like as the narrative progressed, I kind of forgot almost like, and this is I think something Balzac did, and
Yeah,
I almost forgot how much of a dick Andrea really was, because Balzac really swept you away with this, and I'm like, oh, he's really into this music thing. He's swept up by it too. He takes it seriously. And then, yeah, he has this intimate conversation with Mariana. Then, after the opera and after all this, he's like, oh, you should be a poet and not a musician. And it's kind of, that's like, I don't know. That was a really affecting and not in a good way to say. And it was kind of after that Gambara passed out, and nothing was really the same after that.
yeah,
And Balzac, he wins you over at the beginning by being really funny, like right off. And so you almost like want to identify with this guy, and it is really funny. And he talked about how Andrea went to see physicians and stuff, and how like he had some physical issues, and they were like, oh, you should partake in some orgies to make yourself better. And the way like orgies has multiple meanings, and it could have been just a party, but from the context, no, he actually really does mean sex orgies. And again, it kind of just goes back to the French versus English stuff from around then. The French stuff tends to be a lot more frank and open about sex.
yeah. Balzac especially. I mean, it's nothing ever is really explicit in his
Right.
work, but
But it's there.
yeah, it
And
definitely is.
and he talks about prostitutes, and he doesn't feel the need to, like there's no positioning or anything like that. Like it's just there. It's a part of life, right?
Yeah. So, I
So
mean, that's one thing that bowdlerized translations will snip out.
yeah,
Fortunately, the one we read wasn't. But if you're, I guess, planning on exploring his work, that is something to keep in mind, is what translation you are reading.
yeah. So I think we both really like this. I definitely. I mean, I it's exactly the reason you said. Balzac is a name that I've seen around a lot, and it just seemed so daunting because there was
Yeah.
so much stuff, and I
Yeah.
kind of heard that I think some of it wasn't connected, or sorry, was connected, and that made me a little bit even more reluctant because like, where the hell do I start now? Kind of
Yeah.
thing.
I
And
mean, the human comedy is not really like a linear story. There's no
right,
reason to read it sequentially. It just kind of all weaves in and out of one another. And you
yeah,
could really start anywhere. And some of the
I kind of
novels are
figured that.
super long, and some of the short stories are really short. So, really, any place I think is a good place to start. Some of his
Yeah,
books do turn up pretty frequently on the used market, at least in the U.S. I've seen Old Goriot and Cousin Bet and Cousin Pons quite a bit. Maybe some of the others would appear elsewhere more frequently, but
so yeah, and that's cool. I mean, he's obviously one of the many classic 19th century French authors, and there were a good number of them, and I'm a little familiar with some of them, some more than others, obviously. And yeah, Balzac just, and it's again part of this modern mindset where like people get too concerned by irrelevant things, like where do I start? I mean, it is often like what you said, where if an author really wants to tie his work together and it's that extensive, he should have several jumping on points. It shouldn't be like, oh, you have to start here or you won't understand anything. Like it's
right.
not, it's so yeah.
And
Um,
while all of his stories are pretty much connected to everything else, they're also self-contained. So
yeah,
you don't need like a huge amount of backstory of what's going on. Pretty much every story can be read on its own in connection with nothing else, and you still have an enjoyable experience.
so how do you think this one fits into tonight's themes? Basically, I guess is a question that I have.
So, like a lot of the other ones, it really accentuates kind of the mad scientist trope that's coming up, although it does it in a much different way.
Yeah,
So, it's almost secondary to the story, the fact that he's working on this musical instrument. I think what's more the case here is kind of the roguish nature of Andrea and the fact that he's willing to manipulate other people. He's kind of more the focus of the story, even though Gambara's musings on Beethoven and his opera about the life of Muhammad does take up quite substantial portion of the story.
Yeah.
I think Andrea's roguishness is really what kind of propels the plot, whereas Gambara's more of a victim.
He is a victim.
He's not malicious in any way, and while he's incompetent and kind of a fool, and yeah, it's pretty shitty to make your wife work these terrible jobs so you can slave all away at this labor of love, more or less, that is not of interest to anybody but you. That is kind of selfish, but he is portrayed as a victim character, as kind of a tragic figure in ways that I think some of the other mad scientists that we've looked at or really haven't been.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Mahler could have been, but I don't think Whelpley really went far enough. Like he just didn't. He didn't get into a lot of the things that I feel like he could have. So yeah, and in the end, and yeah, he was searching for a kind of ideal, and yeah, the mixture of art and science is a part of this, and yeah, he wanted to have a further higher understanding of sound and its principles.
Specifically as it relates to the creation of a superior art. And
Yes.
I think that will come up in the history of electronic and experimental music throughout the 20th century, 1940s on, when you have these instruments actually existing in the real world and people able to compose music around these new strange devices.
And you using new sounds that don't sound like other instruments. Although
Exactly.
The
And
panharmonicon was supposed to imitate other instruments,
right.
but
It didn't produce novel sounds, but it synthesized them in a sense. So, in a sense, a synthesizer is meant to produce sounds that are already in existence. And, it does have features of producing novel sounds and things like that. But a big function of a modern synthesizer, its ability to mimic a piano or a harpsichord or a bassoon or what have you.
see, I always thought of that as a very modern interpretation of the synthesizer. Like, to me, the synthesizer was, always felt like at first it wasn't meant that way.
Well, yeah,
So
some of
maybe that's
the earliest synthesizers could only generate very basic waveforms. You get a
right.
square wave and you get a straight up sine, we get a sawtooth wave, and that's basically it. And you add a couple of them together, and okay, you get some weird new sounds. But early electronic music were basically electric pianos. So the Audion piano is one of the first instruments to use vacuum tubes that makes it not enormously huge. And it's just basically an emulation of a piano. And people would play it in the exact same way, and they'd play pieces composed or written for the piano on it in the exact same way that you do with a real piano. It's just electric, and you plug it in. Likewise, a lot of the organs that were popular in the 60s were meant to imitate organ sounds. You listen to those Deep Purple records, and yeah, it's a little distorted, but you really hear an organ in there. You know what I mean? It's not like this crazy like space synth Tangerine Dream, or even like wild academic things like Stockhausen or Sabatnik or composers like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that somebody actually, people were thinking of this before it was even a thing. Although, I mean, I know there were already ideas about producing music electrically, at least.
Kind of.
But
It was more on the fringe and didn't really take hold. But I think he raises a really interesting point here, is that he kind of identifies a dichotomy between science and art and how one can enhance one another. And when you look at a lot of, especially the early electroacoustic pieces and early computer music from the 50s and 60s, when the technology is still pretty new, you could really tell who's the engineer and who's the composer, if that makes any sense.
yeah,
So some of those pieces are kind of not that great, but people who are able to integrate the technology with the art in a way that enhances both, I think that's what Gambara was trying to do with his life work here. And it's incredibly forward-thinking for 1837.
yeah, he was well over 100 years ahead of his time if he
Yeah.
had actually been a real person. But
Yeah.
even as a figure in Balzac's head, that's still a thing.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really see this kind of speaking about technology and music this way really until around the turn of the century. So he's several decades before his time for sure.
And we may We may not, but we may yet come back to Balzac at some point. It's a possibility. You know,
Yeah, I think
it's
we
not
might
a
actually.
yeah, I mean, I think a part of the point of doing this is, yeah, we like the tangential stuff. We like the stuff on the borderland because it tends to be really interesting because, it's from people that you don't normally associate with these kind of topics, thinking about the future and about possible developments. And science is not, maybe scientists are an elite in and of themselves, but science affects everybody, right? So why wouldn't Balzac write about this stuff? Why
Yeah,
wouldn't Hawthorne? Why wouldn't other writers who are considered perhaps more literary or more operating in a completely different milieu? So yeah, we may come back. We're talking about. We have a couple of future plans in mind, but yeah, this is just a really well written story. Again, it is kind of mostly tangential, but it does tie into what we're talking about, and it's just really good. And I love the descriptions of music. I love that it made me check out things that I didn't really know about. That's one of the rewarding things about reading certain things, especially with regards to this podcast. And the ending was really sad. It's really
yeah.
sad.
It does kind of have a
So
Deus Ex Machina. The two characters that come in out of the blue and basically, take Gambara and his wife in are these Venetian nobles.
yeah, and it did seem a bit random, by
Yeah,
like, but I did read that they were tied into the rest of the
yeah,
Commedia, man.
right.
So yeah, it made sense. I mean, it didn't hurt the story, oddly enough. I mean, there are other stories. I did a book review, like that's something that I read that I got from my old work years ago of a Dean Koontz book that had a similar, an ending where these random people showed up and like gave everybody a crap ton of money, and it was just totally out of nowhere, and it was so annoying and stupid.
Yeah.
But I think this story was short enough, and this was directed enough that the intentions were not diverted by that. It didn't really hurt the story. It was just like,
No,
okay,
not at all.
well, it's not terrible. It's like it was sad, but it didn't really, yeah, they might be sort of all right now. They're back together. It's a little bit like, yeah, it's kind of pathetic because they're really struggling. Like
Yeah. Their
a
hopes are kind
lot.
of broken, but they're scraping by, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that it's time to move to Eastern Europe and see what's going on in the Russian Empire. There are some interesting developments over there, so we're going to wrap up with three very short stories. And let's take a moment to refresh our palates again, and we will return. All right, we have returned, and this is a real epic podcast, guys. But we're forging on, and we're in Russia now, and we have not. We've been traveling around a bit this time. We will definitely be revisiting Russia because there is a history of Russian science fiction, and until recently, it hasn't really been that recognized in the West. Of course, we're mostly talking about the Soviet era, but there are some pre-Soviet examples as well, and there are some examples of things that were perhaps slightly influenced by stuff that was going on in the West. We're going to cover three authors and their works today, and we're going to start with Dyachkov. So, Nate, maybe you can tell us a bit about this person.
Sure. So Semyon Dyachkov is a pretty obscure author from what I can tell. I don't even have correct birth or death dates, which is also true of the next author we'll be covering. From what I can tell about him, he served briefly as a secretary at the Department of Railways and then
Yeah.
at the Commissariat Department of the War Ministry. He was a pretty major alcoholic, which impaired his work, and he had referenced it in some of his other works that we read, though not this one in particular. His bibliography was looked upon by critics as kind of populist work for common people. This work that we read was from 1844, is called A Trip to the Moon in a Wonderful Machine, with a description of the countries there, customs, and various rarities. So, following on the tradition of Daniel Defoe, he pretty much summarizes the entire plot in the title.
Yeah.
So,
That's what we need to know then.
yeah, this is pretty much the shortest story we read by
Yeah.
a pretty significant margin. This is only about 1,500 words or so.
Yeah.
So he talks about the fact that we can now look at the moon with telescopes, and that gave him an interesting idea of, are there cities on the moon? So he decides to go there and find out. So he builds an apparatus that's like this cage propelled by some kind of gaseous propulsion.
Some air pressure thing.
Yeah, right. And he has
We're not really in Starside territory here.
no.
Yeah.
He has these wings of corkboard that I guess allow it to fly a little bit. So this gets him to the moon in around 40 days. And once he's there, he sees some weird surrealistic stuff, including a cool light show. He goes to a lunar city. A lot of it's made out of crystal. They have some weird customs. There's some odd animals. There's a fruit called a ronbos. And he mentions that lunar people have very direct names, so they're called like Mr. Smart or Mr. Stupid, depending on what their personality traits are.
Yeah, or Miss Gorgeous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're not offended by anything either.
Yeah, right. They're very good sports.
Yeah.
But, he has his fill of the moon, he goes back, and then he realizes it was all a dream, and that's the end of the story.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of weird contradictory things in here. Like, I don't know, he says they don't use money. But then later on he describes, I guess, this awesome food processing machine, basically. That's his cool invention.
It
'Cause
makes
everybody
every
has to have
dish,
one of those.
but they said poor people prefer eat cold food, so they don't need such a machine.
Right. They can't afford the food processor, and they don't mind either. So that of course, the question comes up as to what do you mean they don't have any money, right? So shouldn't everybody have this thing? I don't know. It just seems like you never.
There's
really
no
think
valuable
it's-
metals like gold or silver, but they have like lots of crystalline material. And you think you sub one rare material for another for currency. I mean, it doesn't really do much beyond a basic traveler story.
Right.
And that's all it is. And it was meant to be just pure entertainment. It doesn't really entertain any kind of greater philosophical ideas. It doesn't really explore any character traits or really tries to say anything. It just tries to be amusing for about the 20 minutes that you're going to spend reading it. And it kind of succeeds. It's okay. I wouldn't say it's bad. I wouldn't say it's good. But it's interesting, to say the least. And prior to a couple weeks ago, from what I understand, it was totally unavailable in English.
Right. Okay, so yeah, I should have brought this up before we actually started the story, but Nate actually translated these, so it's actually 4 works that we're covering this time, and not 3. I just kind of lumped the Sigovs
Well, it's
together.
3 authors, so I have 4
Right.
works over 3 authors.
Right.
I
I linked the Sigovs together because they're kind of the
Yeah.
same theme anyway.
Right, they do.
Nate translated the Dyachkov and the Sigov. I've been pronouncing Dyachkov's name wrong this whole time. I just realized. But yeah, the Dyachkov and the Sigov. So can you tell us briefly about the translation process?
Sure. So I started learning Russian about 2 years ago. When my wife and I got married about 3 years ago, we were planning our honeymoon, and we were going to go to Europe. And we were just looking for destinations and stuff. And I encountered this travel vlogging couple who made me really irrationally angry at how stupid American their stereotype
Really?
was. Yeah,
Wow.
and they do this video where they traverse the Trans-Siberian Railway. And I had always had this image in my mind of Russia, even big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, being really dangerous places. And I guess that's just stories that came out of the chaotic Russian 90s is kind of tainting my mind. Because apparently it's nothing like that now, and it's all very safe. And these travel vloggers, who I thought were dumb, to say the least, were very, very obviously rich American tourists, and they're going through rural East Russia and having no problems at all without knowing anything about the language. So I was like, I wonder if going to Russia would actually be feasible as a tourist without any problems. So I spent some time looking into it more, and I decided just to start the Duolingo course on a whim, just to see what the first couple lessons would be like. And at this time, I had already known the Cyrillic alphabet. I learned it a couple years prior, mainly to try to navigate through Russian heavy metal and disco.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand Cyrillic, it will really give you a headache trying to get through reference works. So just to get like band names and things like that down, I taught myself the Cyrillic alphabet. But the words in the first couple lessons really weren't that difficult. And since Russian is an Indo-European language, it does share some very, very basic, although albeit quite distant, ties with English. Some of the grammar works very similar to ways that Spanish conjugates its verbs, but it is quite distant from English in that it's neither a Romance or a Germanic language, it's a Slavic language. As far as I know, all Slavic languages do not have articles, so words like the and a, there are no direct equivalents in Russian for. There's ways to express those kind of concepts, but there's no word that like directly translates from the word in Russian. They also have a very complex case system, which means that in English, a noun doesn't really change depending on where it is in the sentence. So if you take like bottle as a noun, for instance, if I'm holding a bottle, it will have a different form than if I'm putting something into the bottle. The bottle is broken, or depending on what is happening to the bottle, its ending will change. And this is true for nouns and adjectives. So there's 6 different cases in the Russian language. There's 3 genders. So you have this very complex case system, which very specifically identifies words and their position in a sentence. And this cuts down on a lot of filler words that we have in English, which makes the translation process very inexact and open to interpretation in some ways. So when I started the Duolingo course, I just kind of did it on a whim and just decided to stick with it. And I really liked it so far. And as far as a free resource goes, it's absolutely great at building vocabulary and grammar. Pronunciation is a bit different. Some courses are better than others. Russian isn't really that great for giving you accurate pronunciation. But if you're looking to learn like just a little bit of a language that Duolingo has to offer, I think it's a really great resource. As far as it goes for actually translating these works, these are above my reading level knowledge, so a lot of it was dictionary based. For a lot of the individual words that I didn't know, I would use 2 sources, which is Google Translate. So if you translate one individual word, it will give you kind of 3 to 5 or so various options of how frequently it's translated at that, which I think is a really useful tool.
That's interesting.
And based on the word ending, you can kind of figure out where it is in a sentence, how it relates to other words. And I also use a website called Contexto, which I think they offer this service for other languages too, but they also do it for Russian, which allows you to input various phrases and things like that, and it will give you how frequently it's translated as a certain thing. So that helped with some of the phrases that weren't immediately obvious. So yeah, it was quite an interesting process, certainly for a literary perspective and as a language learning utility. But there is quite a bit of these kind of stories written in Russian from around this time. A lot of them are called fantastika, which is a term that I really like.
Yeah.
It's not, fantasy, which has the modern connotations of
and that's not fantasy's fault, but
right. No, it's not.
Yeah.
But these pretty often occupy a weird space between what we would consider fantasy, folklore, and superstitious tales, as well as this kind of stuff, which is more science fiction adjacent. So during the time of these stories that we read, this is later. This particular one is from 1844, but the Sigov ones were from the 1830s, and the Odoevsky was from around the same time, a little later. But this is when Pushkin and Gogol were both writing, who were probably the biggest authors in the Russian language around this time.
And they're definitely fantastica as well, wouldn't they?
Yeah. So Gogol is equally known for his comedies as he is his fantastica works, but his fantastica stuff has this really incredible, like, dark Eastern Gothic vibe to it, which doesn't really translate across into any of these stories here. A lot of these are very more science fiction adjacent rather than kind of spooky folkloric tales. But Pushkin and Gogol definitely have a lot of things like that that are all very horror-ish that I think are really good and effective.
Definitely true of Gogol. The Gogol tales are amazing, like the Ukrainian tales and even the Petersburg ones, which are a bit more grounded in familiar, realistic things, but they still verge into the weird very often.
Yeah.
So, the Dyachkov, I like you said, there's really not much we can say about it. To be honest, I didn't think it was good, really. It didn't really function for me as a satire. It didn't really seem like he bothered to really think anything through. Like he didn't care very much, and it's just a daydream he had. And I guess that's cool,
Yeah.
but there's sort of really not much to it.
No, it's okay. It doesn't really do anything with the genre. It's just a clear example in the Traveler story and how it made its way to Russia.
Right, and it's kind of the things that he didn't seem to care about thinking through, like the whole money thing, and also
Right.
the fact that he says crystal's very common, but stone is like a amazing jewel. Like that doesn't make sense. Like
Yeah.
that's not the way lapidation works. Like it's
Yeah.
just not. So yeah, I don't know. And it's just this very blasé tone, like I built this moon thing, and it was really easy. I put a bunch of books in there and an organ because I wanted to have entertainment and I wanted to play the moon people some nice music.
Yeah.
And it took 40 days, and it took him like over a month to get there, and you'd think like it wouldn't be very comfortable, and yet he like just had lunch with a prince in the
Yeah.
moon and went
Yeah.
home. Like, whatever.
Yeah.
He didn't care. It's fine.
Yeah. Next up
Yeah, the
is
Sigov.
Dmitry Sigov,
Yeah.
who was also a very obscure writer. Again, not able to track down definite birth or death dates. He did live in Moscow from 1830 to 1832, where he served as a clerk at the Department of Mining. After that, he lived at the Urals, where he worked at the Verkh-Izhetsk metallurgical plant. He published several novels, one of which got banned in 1837 for, I guess, his really raunchy descriptions. I was able to find one of the previous novels, again, in Russian, not translated yet into English. So, I mean, this stuff's out there, but even in the Russian sources, he appears to be an incredibly obscure writer.
Seems to be a victim of the censors a little bit.
Yeah, which is common. I mean, pretty much everything in the Russian Empire at this time had to be reviewed by the censors, and it's printed at the beginning of all the novels that it was reviewed and indeed accepted by the censor and is therefore authorized to be printed the set amount of
Gogol
copies.
seemed to be able to get away with a lot, though.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how we got around it. Maybe, yeah. But I mean, it was all very centralized.
Yeah, even then, like, we're talking way pre-communist, but
Oh,
still,
yeah, absolutely. About it. Almost 100 years before the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah. These two stories are both colored by Biela's Comet, which appeared in 1832. And a German guy by the name of Johann Heinrich Jung, who wrote under the name of Heinrich Stilling, were very popular in Russia, and they influenced a lot of superstitious thinking there. Basically, the world was predicted to end in 1836 with the Battle of the Antichrist taking place over Central Asia. Both of these stories, his voyage to the sun, Mercury, and all the other worlds, and the talk of Moscow citizens about the comet were written in 1832. The comet one being the earlier of the two. So in the comet piece, it is a series of 5 kind of satirical dialogues.
It's a play, is what it seems like.
In a sense. There's only one character, well, I guess 2 characters who are kind of in more than one scene. But there's 5 very brief sketches that make fun of the nobility in the first 2 and then the merchant class in the last 3. And they are poking fun of the idea that there's this kind of mass hysteria all around Russia that Biela's Comet, which is currently appearing in 1832, is going to bring about Doomsday.
Yep.
And,
Familiar scenario.
Yeah.
Just reading, everybody's all up and well, I don't know, some people don't care, but it's like, I don't know, apparently there's already a day set for the U.S. election, and there's supposed to be an asteroid coming by or something like that.
Oh, yeah, I heard about that.
It's funny. Yeah. Like, okay, well, so what are we calling it now? Trump's asteroid?
Yeah, right.
It's like, whatever. So people have been obsessed with this kind of thing for a long time, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
And Stilling wrote about this. Right.
Yeah, probably a long time even before this was published. Comet chaos, A lot of people really believed that the world was going to end. And even though the learned newspapers of the time say very clearly that, the comet is totally harmless and you really need a telescope to look at it, people are freaking out that it's going to. The first scene involves the Count, who has nobility title of knyaz in Russian, which doesn't really have a direct English equivalent. It's sometimes translated as Count, but the Count is kind of a rational person who's not superstitious, and he's entertaining this character of Oslinsky, who is kind of jackass, a superstitious scientist who believes in the first thing.
He's a stupid scientist. We don't know what he's a scientist of either. Like, he's just a scientist who doesn't know anything.
Yeah, but his name is the surname form of, like, donkey in Russian.
Yeah.
And he appears in 4 of the 5 scenes. And he's one of the main spreaders of all this Comet paranoia because he has this air of authority about him. So he used to be a scientist back in the day, but now just believes in this total nonsense, and everybody else believes him because he has this former scientific background. He shows up in the second scene, which is between an elderly countess and her granddaughter, and this kind of fool of a servant. I don't know if he's a servant actually, or if he's just some guy that's hanging out. Not really.
He just seems to be this random guy who's hanging out with them. Right?
Yeah.
He's this older guy.
Yeah.
And he never seems to understand anything.
No, he doesn't. But
he reminds me, actually, some of this actually reminded me of the Mummy a little bit.
Right, in a sense.
It's like, kind of like these ridiculous upper class people, and then not really getting anything.
Yeah.
And this weird scientist guy, and who seems to be showing up like randomly in all the scenes except the last one. Like, just kind of, it's that guy again. Like, what now? I know what he's going to say, right? Like,
so the Countess is taking a whole bunch of snuff and getting herself all worked up, and her granddaughter, who, like the Count in the previous scene, is a rational person and thinks all this Comet stuff is a bunch of bullshit, is getting annoyed, and then Oslinsky shows up, and she gets so annoyed that she just basically storms off. And then we cut to the next scene in the merchant district, and the merchants are all gathered together, and they're having a dialogue with one another, and it's a similar kind of thing as the previous scene. Oslinsky shows up at the end, says that will indeed destroy everything, and then the one rational person gets annoyed, storms off. The next scene is set at the house of one of the merchants, where his son is the rational one here. They talk about Oslinsky. He doesn't actually make an appearance, but the merchant from the previous scene, who was totally bowed over by Oslinsky's knowledge about the Comet and Doomsday, is basically repeating it to his son, which annoys his son so much that he storms off. And then the final scene is set in a bookshop. Where,
this was my favorite one.
Yeah.
This and maybe the first one.
Yeah.
I even think the other ones could have been mostly cut out because it was pretty repetitive.
Right, they're almost or less the same thing. Though I did like the Countess taking the stuff and getting herself all worked up. But there's a customer in the shop, as well as the bookseller and his clerk, and the bookseller is a shrewd capitalist at heart. He can see the demand for the Comet hysteria, and he basically is musing to himself at the end, I got to talk to my friend just to get some book out about this, because people are going to buy it up like hotcakes.
Yeah. He charges 50 rubles for it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a perfect idea, but I have a feeling like I remember reading Gogol, I think maybe a story like The Overcoat or something. Mm-hmm. And he talks about his rent in St. Petersburg around the same time being about 4 rubles a month. Yeah. So, like, that's a ridiculous amount of money.
Yeah, right. And it was 5 times the cost of the other book that he pulled off the shelf. So entertaining dialogue's very short. I mean, it's very on the nose with a satire. Everybody has a literal pun for their name describing their personality trait. It doesn't really do a lot of things beyond poke fun of people who are really superstitious about the Doomsday paranoia, but it does provide some really funny images, I thought.
It is funny, yeah. Like I said, I did think it was repetitive, but I guess it wasn't that long. Other than the first and last scene, my favorite thing about it was the little songs at the end of each scene. And it's hard to say, like, you did note down the rhyme scheme and how it went there.
Yeah, I wasn't going to try to make it rhyme, yeah.
Right. And, some translators do that, but you never know what they're really up to, right? So, I mean, it's whatever. It's above our rank, probably, but the thing is, like, it was just cool. Like, it was like kind of the inner thoughts of the characters, I guess, and how they just kind of skip off. And it was usually the sort of rational person who sort of burst into song at the end, and just sort of la la la, this is stupid. Like, how can I get advantage from these dumb people. It's I don't know. It was cute.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And that ties into the other story we read, which is Journey to the Sun and the Planet Mercury, and all the visible and invisible worlds, also in 1832, in which Comet dialogues are explicitly referenced by Sigov here. So this was initially published anonymously and only indicates authorship in the end of the text by going by the letter S. But this is a much different kind of work in that it does take more of the mold of a traveler story, but it seems to be more of a send-up of the traveler genre.
Yeah, it's very satirical.
Yeah, in the beginning, he just kind of babbling about philosophical stuff and just kind of like loses his way.
And he keeps kind of stopping himself and being, I'm being kind of annoying, right?
Right.
And then he kind of... This, to me, worked way better than the Dyachkov.
Yeah.
I mean, it had a lot more God in it, which was slightly annoying, maybe.
Right,
but it was
so the religiosity in Russia at this time was extremely high. So you're going to see that across pretty much all Russian literature from this time. Unlike other traveler stories, he doesn't at all attempt to describe the method in which he actually travels. It's New Year's Day, and his clerk is all drunk, and his friend comes over, and there was predictions of Doomsday happening on the previous night, but that didn't happen. So he tells his friend that he's going to go travel to the Sun and Mercury, and his friend thinks he's like totally crazy. So,
for some reason, he's really happy that his friend thinks he's crazy. I don't really understand that.
Yeah.
But, okay.
But
Sigov seems like a bit of a weird cat, but okay.
Yeah. But he just appears to just fly off the ground.
Uses his mind, the power of his mind.
So he gets to the Sun just by flying there and by his own willpower, however it is. Again, gets lost in his philosophical musings and describes more the beings there rather than the sights, although we do get some nice descriptions of lakes of fire and pillars of fire and stuff like that on the Sun.
This is basically where the angels live.
Yeah, right, exactly. So kind of the Dante construction of the universe where all of the bodies of the solar system are heavenly worlds. That's what this is, the Sun and Mercury. People that died and went to heaven, essentially. They're telling him that he can't join them until the same journey of death.
Yeah.
And he inquires about the apocalypse and is greeted with a response that it's basically all nonsense and that, the end times won't happen until, willed divinely, that superstitious things about comets just aren't what is going to happen.
Right, because God doesn't want it that way.
Right.
If he did, you would know.
Yeah.
Right? So,
Which, in a sense, also sets it out from a lot of other traveler stories. Is a lot of traveler stories kind of explore ideas and future scenarios where this almost takes an opposite approach, where it kind of disregards science more heavily than the previous story did, but instead places all faith in religiosity and all kind of movements in that.
So then we go to Mercury, right? So I have a question about this. This was never really clear to me. I was kind of confused. It seemed like maybe Sigov was a bit confused. Did he understand the difference between a planet and a comet or not?
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. He has some very strange descriptions on how they behave in the
it's like a planet is a comet without a tail?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And so what was the deal with Mercury? Sometimes he seemed to say that the comet was dangerous, and sometimes he said Mercury was dangerous?
I think Mercury was probably very bright in the sky or something like that at the time. I'm not exactly sure of where Mercury was in 1832, but if they were really that worried about the comet, if Mercury or another planet appeared really bright or something like that, I could see that signifying something that might cause people to think it's Doomsday, especially if they're that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like he was using it interchangeably, and I didn't really get that. I didn't understand what the deal was. Did they think Mercury was going to fall out of orbit or something? I don't know.
Yeah, that
and even if so, wouldn't it fall into the sun? I don't know. It just...
Right. Yeah, not a very strong understanding of astronomical physics here.
Right. But this was fun. I appreciate Sigov's sense of humor. And I think that even though, yes, it was sort of religious, that, I don't know, he had a certain lightheartedness to it that made it more enjoyable than it might have otherwise been.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even though, again, what irritated me with Dyachkov was that he didn't really seem to care about what he was inventing. You know, just and Sigov might not either, but he just makes it more fun, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
It's like it's not so. Hi, let me tell you about this dream I had for a couple minutes. You
Yeah.
know, yeah, it's a bit
He's
more
definitely poking a lot of fun at it. Yeah.
right. I enjoy what he said at the end of the story. He
Kind Russian people will supply an income.
yeah, he was basically saying, oh, we'll just summarize it then.
Yeah.
So he was basically saying that I know this is just some little story I wrote, but it's kind of important, and the Russian people will pay a lot of money for it.
Yeah, right.
And it's like it was kind of like the whole the kind of a mirror of the last scene of the talk of a Moscow citizens.
Right.
And that he's like, yeah, I need to make some money, so it was kind of bald faced and funny, like he's reasonably self effacing about it, and it was kind of it was on the nose in a cool way, so it was a nice pithy way to end the story, I
Yeah.
thought.
And from what I understand, these chapbooks were pretty popular. These works are relatively short, and they
Yeah.
were sold as individual books. They weren't part of short story collections or something like that.
Right.
But small books that could be carried in your pocket, sold at whatever corner shop or whatever. From what I understand, they were pretty popular, and I was able to track down a couple other ones, which were substantially longer than these, which do remain untranslated. So
yeah.
there's a certainly wealth of stuff like this out there that remains to be accessed by the English-speaking world, which I think is pretty interesting.
It is interesting. I mean, I would think that most of it probably aged very quickly.
Yeah.
And that's why it wasn't translated.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I could
Right.
definitely see why priority is given to like Pushkin or Dostoevsky over something like this. But
Yeah.
for people doing deep dives, it's out there.
So how much do you think that people like us, I kind of feel like Dyachkov probably just didn't give a damn, but how much do you think somebody like Sigov or even the next author might have been aware of what was going on in the Western tradition of the traveler and so on in the early 1800s?
They were probably aware. So Russia was certainly not as closed off during imperial time as it was
Right.
during the communist times.
No,
And
definitely
French was like the aristocratic language, even in
Yeah,
Russia.
I was just going to say that.
Um,
So I'm guessing that Jules Verne was probably popular
Oh,
in Russia
absolutely.
at some point.
Yeah. So
yeah.
one of the sites that I found the original Russian text on is a really great bibliography of Fantastica, which has not only Russian authors, but translations of foreign authors as well. So they had like 75 different Jules Verne works that were translated into Russian on the site, and I'd imagine a lot of them are 19th century translations. So
Right.
yeah, Jules Verne would have been widely read.
And
in
that would have been
Russia.
historically important to see how those translations were.
Yeah.
See, I mean, because translating from French to Russian would be just as open to interpretation as going the other way.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
this is the kind of thing that would interest real nerds about this kind of stuff. It's how this happened.
Mm-hmm.
Were the censors involved? How much did they have to do with it? What did the translator have to adjust? It's always interesting. We have this in our modern times too, but definitely a couple hundred years ago that would have been a concern. And I mean, I'm one of those people too. I'm not necessarily well versed in all the classics, but I do get a sense that a lot of the more contemporary, like the modern translations of Russian stuff, are better than the old ones.
So this is the point where I would like to make a defense of Constance Garnett.
Okay.
I think she has been unfairly maligned over the times. Translation is a very imprecise art, and you're translating for an audience. Like, there's no one-to-one the right way to translate something. And Constance Garnett was writing for a 19th century English audience, and that's going to read differently than somebody translating for a 21st century American audience.
Yeah.
And I get that Constance Garnett might feel awkward and clunky to some people, but she does capture the original spirit of the text. She doesn't cut anything out. She doesn't add a lot of stuff that isn't there. It's a really involved process, and you really have to consider who your audience is reading it to make something smooth and not feel unnatural. And it really does require a lot of moving words around, especially when you're dealing with languages that are as far apart from one another as English and Russian are.
I like her. I mean, again, I'm not an expert who spent a lot of time with this, but I think her Chekhov translations are pretty good.
Yeah, I have no
but
problems with her
when
at
I
all.
tried to compare the Dostoevsky, I thought that hers were definitely missing something.
Yeah, I mean,
so
the Pavir and Volkonsky translations that have come out in the last 20 or so years, they cover pretty much all the big name Russian authors
Yeah.
from the 19th century, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. I'm sure they do a couple others too. But those are the ones to check out for that.
Yeah.
But if you see a Constance Garnett at the thrift store for 10 cents, it's worth grabbing.
Well, that's cool. I'm glad you made that defense. That's
Yes.
that was an interesting introduction that I appreciate because I've thought about that before. Because a lot of the ones on Gutenberg, for example, are her translations.
Yep, they
And
certainly are.
I mean, like I said, I really did enjoy the Chekhov. But again, I wasn't comparing them. But I feel like his spare language might have been better for
Yeah.
her pen than Dostoevsky's, maybe.
Right.
And
Right.
so his stuff is a lot more full of idioms, which I think that modern translators are more free with.
Sure.
They're a bit more like capturing.
He's also a lot more direct, and
Yeah.
Dostoevsky has a tendency to philosophize.
Yeah. So our final work of the night was in fact previously translated. It's
Yeah,
called
so
the Petersburg Letters.
I did not do this one. This one was translated also very recently by somebody named John Kuti in 2013. So this is freely available online. He's probably, I don't know anything about him, somebody like us who's just a fan that wants to read this stuff. At least that's what I'm imagining anyway. Odoevsky was less obscure than Dyachkov and Sigov, so he held the title of knyaz, which is the same royal title that a couple of the characters from Sigov's Comet dialogues held.
Yeah.
He co-edited the literary magazines The Contemporary and The Herald of Europe with Pushkin, who's pretty much universally revered as best poet of all time from
The
Russia.
central figure
Yeah.
in Russian poetry.
Right, exactly.
Very interesting figure.
His novella, The Queen of Spades, was very influential to both Russian literature and to Odoevsky.
And he had African heritage, which I always thought was really interesting.
Yeah. So inspired by that, Odoevsky wrote a number of romantic and fairy tale stories. So he wrote quite a bit of stuff. Russian Nights is a collection of his philosophical essays and some of his short stories. He also wrote some novels. But he was also interested in technology. So he wrote an early text on electroplating in 1844. He wrote some music theory criticism as well. And in his later in life, he promoted public education, and he served as a director of the Rumyantsev. So this particular work, the year 4338 Petersburg Letters, was published in fragments. Some are from 1835, others from 1840. And it's not really clear what comes from where, but the entire thing wasn't published together until 1926. So it is very fragmented apart.
Yeah, it looks like he didn't finish it.
Yeah, he didn't.
And it's definitely further in the future than we've ever been.
Oh, yeah, far
so far
further.
in this podcast.
And the technology also reflects that here.
Yeah.
It has an identical setup pretty much to Montesquieu's Persian letters, where he has foreigners, in this case, Chinese citizens, traveling through Russia and then providing their commentary and views on what they see. So here we have these characters who are practicers of mesmerism, and they can traverse time and space. So they go to the year 4338, and this is when Biela's comet is supposed to collide with Earth. Fortunately for the people of 4338, Biela's comet burned up in the atmosphere in the late 1800s. So,
but it left a lot of destruction and rubble and stuff.
Right.
Apparently.
Yeah. So if you're listening in 4337, no worries about the comet. There's lots of kind of disparate pieces here. It doesn't really do much plot-wise beyond a traveler story, but a lot of the future tech that they mention is really interesting.
Yeah,
it talks
it's
about
like Jane Webb level, but more so.
More so. Yeah, it predicts flying machines. There's an electro carriage with galvanic headlights. Yeah. There's thermal geoengineering, which vent air into reservoirs. Communication by telegraph. This is actually, I'm unsure of where the telegraph parts come in. Cook-Wheatstone telegraph, which is the first commercial telegraph that was used on British rail, was, I believe, established in 1837. So that would have been after the 1835 segments, before 1840. So it's unclear what comes where here. It's probably from the 1846 segment, but there were some earlier telegraph demonstrations done, including in Russia, that could have influenced him, especially if he was more technologically minded, which it looks like he was. There's steam power, where the future people are kind of baffled by the fact that anybody would use it, as they said it was extremely dangerous. Yeah. There's like personal newspapers that are delivered to people, as well as a magnetic telegraph system. where it's
Right.
kind of
They're
information
like
is translated.
on-demand newspapers.
Yeah, yeah,
And the Steam thing is interesting too because I mean, it's not exactly that. I mean, there were certainly some dangers involved, but you wouldn't think in that time period people would say, "Hey, this isn't necessarily the most practical way to power things,"
yeah,
right?
right,
Uh,
yeah,
I mean, even you have in the Jane Webb, like all these devices that almost seem like electrical devices that we have now, but they're all steam powered. And Odoevsky was already saying, no, that's not practical, or at least these people in 43, 38 were saying that. So, yeah, it's pretty far out with that. And yeah, it's kind of cool that he made the traveler a Chinese guy. But then he spends the whole time like worshiping Moscow and the Russians and
yeah,
how
right,
awesome they are.
yeah,
And he even says like, my people are not ready for this kind of technology and this kind
right,
of advancement.
yeah,
So it's a little bit, it kind of undercuts the progressive quality of having a person from China narrating a Russian's story.
yeah.
But
Russia's portrayed as like this ancient cultured empire,
yeah,
whereas Chinese society has only recently revived. It's not really clear of what happened to Chinese society the past 2,000 years, but American society is portrayed as like total barbarians, which I think is a funny kind of recurring theme that we see in some of these other works.
yeah. It's almost
Like,
like he's being really super humble, like
yeah,
for no reason. Kind of like, yes, we are. And again, it's kind of maybe a little bit of an Asian stereotype almost.
yeah,
Like, it's like we're either very inscrutable or very humble, like ridiculously so almost. I don't know. It's
yeah.
just, yeah. But yeah, it was really original and interesting in that. In
Yeah, I think it was enjoyable,
so
even though it was pretty disjointed. It really did express some projection of future technology.
I like the scene where they're on the train and it's like pretty clearly a tube train kind of, and they have to stop because there's like rubble on the line that has to be cleared, and there are all these people that are annoyed that they had
Yeah,
to like it's very modern. It reminds
yeah,
me of like trying to go home from work on the train and
right.
being like, oh god, another delay, and this time it's like some meteorites fell down or something like that.
Yeah.
Presumably, maybe as a result of this comet. I don't know.
I think that might be the only Comet tie-in. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's also some totally weird stuff, like there is in Webb. There's like a water-based keyboard type instrument.
Yep.
There is or elastic crystal as women's fashion. There's also horses that are no longer their natural size, but are like all these like really tiny
Yeah.
cat or
So
dog size animals.
all the like burden animals and stuff, they've now been so domesticated that they're like a quarter of their previous size,
Yeah,
and they're like more like cats and dogs are now.
yeah,
Huh. That was interesting. I think that is a somewhat forward thinking. I mean, it sounds a bit weird, but it's like somebody thought, well, we don't need those animals as that anymore, and how are they going to be bred in the future? What are we going to make them do? Maybe at some point it's going to be like this, and it's like you see, like ponies, for instance, like small ponies, then they go from ponies to like dog size, and it gets more and more so until they're like pets for children and stuff like that. And it's not like we obviously don't need them to carry stuff anymore, right? Because we have all this nice tech. So yeah, I don't know. That was, and I'm sure somebody in that time would have enjoyed reading about that and being like, "Huh,
yeah, for sure.
wow, we won't be using horses anymore in
Yeah.
the 40th century," right?
He also predicts the death of the novel and says it's going to be replaced by theater, and textbooks going to be replaced by and public lecture.
Yeah. Now that was in the latter portion. It
Yeah.
almost seemed like I don't even know where all that stuff came from because there was
Yeah.
no narrative. Like it was just kind of a bunch of stuff. Like it reminded me of the end of Bacon's New
Yeah.
Atlantis almost. Like it was just where they just collect all these ideas and yeah, like a lot of them are really far out. They have no context.
Yeah,
So apparently Russia buys England. Like that's just mentioned offhand. Like that England is it's pretty much for sale now, and Russia buys it.
it does explicitly mention The Last Man by Shelley, though, so that was a clear influence here.
Yeah, where does that come up again?
It's in the notes at the end. It's just a totally offhand reference, but
Right.
you know, you would have had to read it or know about it to make a reference to it. So
Obviously, yeah. Interesting. So, does that mean it was translated into Russian?
it must have been, unless you could read English.
Oh. It just didn't seem like a well-known enough book to be translated into Russian, but maybe so. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's like he could have known English, I guess.
yeah,
It's like we were talking about during that episode, like it wasn't very well read at the time, so it just seems odd that he would have known about it almost.
yeah. Well, I mean, this would have been almost right after its publication, so maybe he got it on its initial printing when Mary Shelley was still alive and still an active name that people watch out for, because it was suppressed, and once it's suppressed, it's not getting reprinted. But if you got it on its initial printing run, then maybe it's made its way over.
So yeah, this was a really, this was an interesting journey, and I didn't mind that there wasn't really much of a story because it was just exploring this world. Now towards the end, when it was like this is the end of the narrative, and now it's just like it looks almost like notes for what he was intending to do later.
Yeah.
So there wasn't, like it was just a bunch of stuff. But it's still, like, interesting stuff because, we're talking about a very early time period for even thinking about this kind of stuff. So, and I wrote down a whole bunch of it, and there's really too much to name. Like, he talks about not only would the novel be a dead art form, but machines will start doing all the writing. Like, actual machines will not, like, they will be... And that's something that... you see well over 100 years later, in something like Fritz Leiber's book, The Silver Eggheads, which is about a guy who's supposed to be an author, but all the books are written by machines. And, it's like the conflict that this guy has is he wants to write books, and they call him an author, but his real job is actually to maintain these machines that write the books. So he's not actually writing anything. He's actually, like, maintaining mechanisms. And that's 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 something we don't see till the early 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
So again, this is way ahead of its time. There's some weird shit that doesn't make sense. Like there's talk in here about phrenology, which is pretty much completely debunked.
Yep.
Right.
Also, animal magnetism. I mean.
Yeah, and he says that like they'll use phrenology to basically eliminate crappy mindsets and hypocrisy and stuff like that. Like, okay, good luck with that. Right. But, I mean, a lot of this is idealized, again, and mostly idealizing Russian society.
Yeah.
Specifically. So, I mean, I would be surprised if all the countries we know, like maybe this sounds pessimistic, but I don't necessarily mean it that way, but I would be surprised if 1,000 years from now, any countries that are around right now really survive in their present form. But
I'm sure a couple might, but borders change. That's just something that happens.
Yeah. And I know, like, sometimes when you talk about that kind of stuff with people, they get upset. Like, this is my country. What do you mean? But
I mean,
I don't know.
Look at a map of Europe in 1000, and it looks
right, exactly. It's like it looks so different than it does now, and I mean, places that we live in, like Canada and the United States, like who knows?
Yeah.
40th century, there may be dozens of nations in this part of the world that don't exist right now. So I don't know, but whatever. I get it. It probably made his stuff easier to pass through the censors too, that it was so Russian centric.
Yeah.
So, although this guy seems to have been reasonably well off, maybe he had less problems passing his stuff through anyway, right?
Right,
so,
and especially considering it was all published together posthumously in the 1920s after the revolution, so it would have had to deal with stricter communist censors rather than the censors of the Russian Empire.
Yeah. Now, there's an interesting thing here where people theorize that after the communist revolution, science fiction did all right in Russia. Fantasy and horror, if we're talking genre ideas, did not do so well because of various factors. Fantasy, that it was not realistic enough, and horror, that it reminded people too much of bad things.
Right.
Science fiction, though, was forward-thinking. It, the Russian socialist, the Russian social system, the Soviet social system would have really endorsed the ideas of scientific advancement, and certainly did. So it made sense that science fiction was a going thing, even though, and we saw many, like, science fiction movies and so forth in Russia, but pretty much no horror or fantasy movies that were not inspired by people like Pushkin and Gogol.
Yeah, right.
So,
yeah. There's a lot of Pushkin adaptation in the 60s.
And that's because he was so important to the history of Russian literature, not because he was a fantasist.
And we'll get more into communist era Russian sci-fi later on, but I think the overall trend is that Stalin's era stifled pretty much all artistic creativity.
Yeah, and we definitely will get there, and it will be interesting. There's definitely some interesting authors from the communist period.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so some of them are reasonably well known in the West, but even so, I would argue probably not enough. People like the Strugatsky brothers, and even though he's Polish, Stanislaw Lem,
right,
and so forth. And there's more. So those are our stories. We have covered 10 tales tonight, and I don't know about you guys, but it's been quite a journey. This was a really exciting episode to do. There's just so much stuff to cover and just so much ground. And so many interesting connections to make. There were good stories and bad stories. Nate, what would you say were your, it doesn't have, the order doesn't matter so much, but what were your top 3 stories of the 10?
I would say Sandman, Rappacini's Daughter, and Gambara.
Jesus. Those are mine.
Well, all right.
Okay, well, all right. So we're on the same page pretty much.
So everybody reads Sandman, Rappacini's Daughter, and Gambara.
Yeah. I mean, I feel almost like I didn't have enough to say about Gambara, but the thing is, like, you can't really, like, so much of it is just the feeling of it, and just, like, just the rapturous descriptions of music, and the characters, and their multi-dimensional nature, and so forth. You can't really, you don't want to spoil it, you just want to read it.
Yep.
So, I think that is the essence of a good story. It's not just a bunch of stuff that happens. There are many layers. And it's good to peel them back. So I hope that everyone enjoyed this episode of 10 Steps on the Quest for the Ideal. And next time we will be talking about Journeys to the Moon, which is a nice segue from where we just were with the Sigov. We will be covering Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and another Russian. I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name already.
Tsiolkovsky.
Okay, yes. So it'll be an interesting one, because obviously the moon has been with us since our very first episode. People trying to get there, and they're still trying to get there. And even to this day, it's like it's happened once, but nobody cares that much anymore about getting there again. So it's kind of interesting that it was such a thing, and it was like some people wrote about it in the sense that it was the easiest thing in the world, like just building an air pressure machine out of nowhere, and some people went through a lot of trouble to describe how it might happen. And next time we're going to cover 3 people that did that, and we're
also going to cover a couple hoaxes too.
That's right. Then there were some interesting hoaxes, and there's Edgar Allan Poe has an involvement, and we're going to cover one of his shorter pieces called The Unparalleled Adventures of Hans Pfaall. And we're going to cover From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. And we're going to cover The First Man in the Moon, which is our first of what I think is going to be many explorations of the really awesome, fascinating Herbert George Wells. So that I hope that everyone is looking forward to. I think we'll finish off by just giving the links where you guys can all find us. We're slowly, starting to amass content. It is a slow process getting everything together, and I personally have issues with all the different platforms that sometimes I have a hard time coming to grips with. But, we're getting it, slowly getting more content, and maybe at some point we'll be able to get some discussions going and stuff like that. We have a blog spot, which is at
chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com.
And there's also the Facebook page, which is at /chrononautspodcast. And the Twitter page, which is /chrononautsSF. All right, probably most of you don't go to direct Twitter URLs. You probably use some kind of app, so you just search for chrononautsSF. What's the Goodreads URL?
It doesn't really have a good URL to give, so just look us up, Chrononauts on Goodreads, and you should be able to find us.
Cool. And then there we'll have all the books up on the blogspot right now. We have the translations of Dyachkov and Sigov, and we also have Whelpley's story, The Atoms of Chladni, which is a little difficult to find. And there's a bit more content on there, so definitely check that out. And I'd like to say thank you to our listeners. Thank you to Anne for contributing to our previous episodes, and Yifang for impetus, and that's it. So I think that we've covered a lot of ground. We've been talking for a long time, so thanks for putting up with our awesomeness. And see you guys next time in probably about a month.
Good night.
Good night.